Part 2. The Changelings.
A long time ago.
Jagged fell guides his clawcraft into the belly of Ralroost with the steady hand of a lifelong pilot. When his craft is fully settled, he shuts down the engines and repulsor slips, pops the vacuum seal on his cockpit, and eagerly pulls himself out to breathe the cool recycled air of Admiral Creefy's flagship. He spares a few brief words for Shankar and his other Chiss pilots, then makes a beeline across the busy deck. He can see her waiting in the entry to the hallway on the far side, a small woman in a dark green flight suit, brown hair down, and framing her face, just the way he likes it. When he reaches her, he doesn't stop. He takes her by the waist with both hands, pushes her into the shadows, and kisses her on the mouth. He's surprised by his own desire. A lifetime among the Chiss has made him an expert at stifling his emotions and focusing on his duty instead of his need. Now, after a long and dangerous away mission, he finds that all he needs is Jaina Solo. When he finally breaks away for oxygen, Jaina pushes him away. For a second, he panics that he's gone too far, but then he hears her giggling. It's a silly, girlish laughter, the kind he's not used to hearing from her. When he takes a step back and looks in her brown eyes, he sees a new infectious joy. When he first met Jaina over Aether, he was surprised how young she seemed. He told her she wasn't grim enough. Then she'd lost both her brothers on the same day, and that loss had made her far too grim. But now here she's, smiling, eyes blazing with happy energy. She takes his hands in hers and says, "Hey, fly boy, have a nice trip." You could say that. Jag allows a smile. Smiling still feels a little strange, like someone is tugging his face in weird directions. "You seem chipper." "Of course I'm chipper." Jaina squeezes his hands. "Jason's back." Of course, Jag thinks. He knows her brother, captured by the U.S. Hinvong and Mirker and left for dead, has in fact returned. He'd been so eager to see Jaina herself that he nearly forgot. "I heard on HoloNet," Jag says congratulations. "Come on," Jaina tugs him down the hall, still holding both hands. "He's here on Ralroost." Well, that explains it. He works one hand free so she can stop walking backwards, then lets her drag him down the hallway. He's happy for Jaina, happier than he can say, but he feels a spike of sadness inside. When Jaina lost both siblings, a perverse part of him was almost glad, because it gave them something in common. Jag's brother Davin and his sister Sheris had both been almost 10 years older than him, and they both died so long ago he could barely remember them. They died as warriors and brought honor to the Fell family name, but they lingered through his youth as haunting figures. He is not the last child of Suntir and Syal Fell. Chak has his own ship in the CEDF, and his younger brother Sim and sister Win are both training. Someday they will follow the family tradition and go into the military. He wonders which of the clan will be the next to follow Davin and Cheris. Sometimes he wonders if it will be him. But when Jaina pulls him through the door to Ralroost's auxiliary pilot's ready room, he does his best to push the sadness and foreboding away. You can't be grim all the time. It's probably the best lesson he'd learned from Jaina, one for which he is eternally thankful. The ready room is empty except for two people sitting on the sofa in the far corner. Their bodies are angled toward each other, but their postures bespeak caution rather than intimacy. When Jag and Jaina enter, they both look up, startled out of an apparently personal conversation. Jag knows Tahiri Veila. The blonde girl, small and pretty except for the scars on her forehead, loved Jaina's younger brother Anakin, and has become something of an honorary member of the Solo family since his death. Despite the bond she and Jaina share, Jag has always found Tahiri a little off-putting. Maybe it's because he is uncomfortable with grieving. Maybe it's because those scars, left by U.S. Hinvong shapers, hint at something more menacing behind her pretty face. Maybe it is because she does not speak plainly, and seems suspicious of everything, including herself. He has never met the young man with the brown hair and trim beard before, but he can see Jaina in his eyes. Jaina Solo rises to his feet and puts on a smile. "So," Jason looks Jag up and down, "I guess you're okay?" "Stop it." Jaina slaps him on the shoulder, giggling again. Jag, meet my brother Jason. Jason, meet Jag Fell. Nice to meet you, Jag extends a hand. He's never been good at meet and greets and stumbles for something to say. You look good for a dead man. Thanks, Jason chuckles. You should have seen me a month ago. Jason sits back down next to Tahiri, and Jaina and Jag plop onto the sofa facing them. Jaina sidles close and loops her arm around Jag's in an open display of affection. He's not used to those, and he tries not to blush. Jag tries to keep his attention on Jason. He looks young and old at once, childlike but immensely serious. If Jaina's come to possess a certain grimness, her brother has, perhaps in intensity. When Jason looks at him, Jag feels like he's being scrutinized somehow. So, Jag says, awkwardly keeping his gaze, I understand you were held captive by the U.S. in Vong for almost a year. Stang it, Jag. Jaina shakes her head. He doesn't want to talk about that. I don't mind, Jason says, and Jag can tell he's not being polite. It's like he actually doesn't mind talking about spending months being tortured by a race of ferocious genocidal aliens. Jag doesn't know what to make of that either. Let's talk about something else, Jaina says. Jason, why haven't you gone off to Hapes yet? Tinelka would love to see you. Now it's Jason's turn to blush. He seems young and earnest again. I just haven't got around to it. Sorry. There's so much to do, with the war and all. Well, what about Danny Kui? Jag, you remember her from Borlius, right? Blonde, beautiful scientist. Very smart. She's on Mon Cal now, and she and Jason have been spending a lot of time together. Doing really serious stuff, like sunbathing and coral reefs, taking long walks along the esplanade at Hurkia City. It's not like that. Jason shakes his head. Jason, I know you can be pretty dense with these things, but trust your twin sister. It is like that. Tahiri laughs, but there's sadness in her eyes. She says, it's good to see you two together like this. It's almost like her expression wavers, and her eyes gleam with tears. I'm sure he'd love to see you now. An awkward silence falls over the room. Jag tries to think if he's ever had a conversation like this with his surviving siblings, full of teasing and implications. With Wynsa sometimes. She's always been the most rebellious and rambunctious of the Fell children, the one who refuses to be chained down by the strictures of Chiss society. It's something he's always found alternately endearing and annoying about her. You're together again, Tahiri says firmly, blinking away her tears. There's nothing you can't do. I'd like to think so, Jason favors her with a soft smile. You're twins. Family, she says. There's nothing that can break that. Not all the Vong, Sith, or madmen in the galaxy. Nothing. Chapter 7. Well, that settles it, Mary sighed. We're borked. Jagged Fell stood with his hands planted on his hips, scowling at the communications console. The auxiliary command room on Starless was a small space, mostly used for emergency overrides and system checks. Now that space was crammed with people. He was on his feet, next to Trace Creefy. Miri Antilles and Thames Fodrick, the Wraith Squadron communications expert, were crouched around the console from which, in theory, they should be able to start an ultra-encrypted tight beam communication with Coruscant. Miri's sister Sayal stood slightly apart. Her arms were crossed over her chest and a worried frown wrinkled her face. I don't understand, Sayal said. The console seems to be working. It is, Miri sighed. We've double and triple checked the systems. The signal is beamed via the Esfandia relay to Coruscant, correct? Creffy asked. When Thames nodded the Bothan said, well, perhaps we're simply sending it to the wrong place. We've double and triple checked our position against the star charts the Chiss have provided us, Jack said. The constellations are a perfect match. We know exactly where we are and where we're pointing the transmitter. We're just not getting a response. Could something have happened on Coruscant or Esfandia? Sayal asked gravely. Last we heard there was some civil unrest in the capital, but nothing that could have brought down the government. Thames shook his head. And according to Director Lauren, the system is rigged with an automated response at both stations. The only way to stop that would be to blow up one of the most secure buildings in the galaxy. It could be something simple, Myri offered. Some gases or weird interference that's not on our charts. Or it could be something wrong with Starless herself. She took some hurt during the fight in the nebula. We've been communicating regularly with Jaina on Zanima Second, Jagged said, not to mention the other ships in the fleet. Short-range and long-range transmitters use different systems, Thame said. One could conk out without the other being affected. I'll authorize an EV team to check the communications arrays, Sayal said. Very good, Jag nodded. I'll talk to Captain Pavrik and see if Karuska Gem has better luck. I suppose I can also contact Celestial and see if they have any idea what's blocking us. The others nodded but said nothing. Conversations with Wynsa had been tense lately, but he was hoping his sister would be amenable to this simple query. Thames ran a hand through his short hair, then raised it in the air. Okay, I've got a question. Why not jump out of the system and try a different location? Jagged fought a frown. The thought of separating the already beleaguered Trinity fleet was unappealing from a tactical standpoint. Leaving Jaina behind on the planet was even less so. We should double-check the communications arrays first. Sayal came to his rescue. We can make more informed decisions after that. Agreed. Creffy nodded and looked at Jag. What is the latest update from the planet? Our techs have just taken a preliminary review of the damaged hyperdrive system. I think Jaina's going to head out there and help. And the communications? Asked Thames. Short range is workable. Our people are also installing a long-range beacon that will, hopefully, allow us to keep tabs on the planet for years to come. Sounds good to me, Mary sighed. Then we won't have to chase this criffing thing down every other decade. Indeed, Creffy grunted. Well, we should begin survey work. I'll get an EV crew ready. Sayal looked at the two wraiths. I'll let you know when they're out. You can help provide diagnostics from this end. Aye, Captain. Mary tipped her sister an informal salute. Sayal nodded in reply, then walked out of the room. Creffy followed, and Jag followed him. When he got into the hallway, Sayal was already walking ahead at a clipped, determined pace. Jagged was still not used to how unlike the Antilles sisters were. Myri, with her multicolored hair, casual demeanor, and party girl reputation, stood in stark contrast to Sayal's sober military reserve. It was a strange comparison to Jag's own sister. When he was young, he had been the determined, professional soldier, while Wen had exhibited a wild free spirit rarely seen in Chiss society. Jagged had never considered himself wild or free-spirited, but 20 years later Wen seemed to see him that way, while she herself acted like the perfect Chiss naval officer. It didn't feel like their roles had been reversed, not exactly, but they had certainly changed. He thought, with a tinge of sadness, that things might have been different if Davin, Cheris, Chak, or Sem had survived. All of them, some of them, any of them, it didn't matter. Maybe then his family would seem less broken. You seem pensive, Creffy muttered. Jag realized he'd slowed his pace as he walked down the hall. Sorry. Just feeling a little weak. Do you feel you've recovered from your ordeal on Phoenix? Creffy asked. As much as possible, I mean. Jag resisted the urge to touch the black patch strapped over his left eye. The patch still itched sometimes, and the strap pinched the skin of his forehead. His vision seemed strangely flat also, and he had to crane his head to the left more often. He would probably get used to it all eventually, just like his father had. He didn't know why the thought made him uneasy. I'm managing, Jag said at last. Thankfully, Creffy was walking on his right side. I'm still hoping to get a prosthetic once this is all over. Of course, Creffy said. The old Bothan looked like he wanted to say more, then trailed off. Are you all right? Jag asked. He didn't know how to approach Creffy. 15 years ago he'd served under the Bothan, looked up to him as an exemplary commander. Now his tactical mind still seemed sharp, but time had worn away the charisma and vigor that had made him such a good admiral. He was half hoping Creffy would brush aside his query, just as he had Creffy's. Instead, As they drew closer to the turbolift, the ex-admiral said, "May we talk in private, Commander?" Of course, Jagged nodded. When the elevator arrived, he punched in the deck where his ready room was located. The two of them rode to their destination in awkward silence. Jagged's ready room was about a quarter of the size of his office as Imperial Head of State, but he liked it more. The desk, the shelf of datapads, and the soft-back chair were plain and informal. He pulled 2 chairs in front of the desk, sat down in one, and beckoned Christie to do the same. The Bothan settled down in the chair opposite Jagged. His violet eyes seemed to scour the room, resting on everything but Jagged himself. "May I ask what's bothering you, Admiral?" "I'm no admiral." The Bothan shook his head. "Still," said Jagged, "what is it?" Christie finally faced Jagged, but his vision still hovered somewhere above the human shoulder. He asked, "When you were captive aboard Phoenix, did you talk with Ben and Tahiri?" "Ah, of course." The entire reason Christie had joined them on this quest into the unknown regions was because his former protege was leading the renegade fleet. "I did speak to him, though he wasn't in the room when Boba Fett did this to me." Jagged pointed to his eye patch. "That's more than I've done in, at least 4 years." Christie leaned forward. "Tell me, how did he seem?" Jagged thought about that. Erefja had come to him and asked him to join the renegade fleet. It was the kind of obvious offer made to any prisoner, the carrot before the stick. When Jagged refused, as they both knew he would, the stick came out. The threats of torture delivered not with malice or sadistic zest, but with the tone of reluctance. At first Jagged had thought it feigned, but as he replayed the scene in memory, he began to suspect that Erefja had, in fact, been saddened and squeamish at the thought of torture. "He seemed trapped," Jagged said. Christie's ears twitched. "I don't understand." "No, not trapped. He seemed like he was scared. Like he was on a wild land speeder that was veering out of control, and he was clinging on as hard as he could, because as dangerous as the ride is, falling off would be even worse." The edges of Christie's mouth drooped in a Bothan frown. "Ben isn't just along for the ride. He is the ride. It's his land speeder." "You haven't experienced Nadasidala," Jagged said dryly. "But I think there was more than that. Can you tell me about Erefja, as you knew him?" "I've known him for some time," Christie said guardedly. "He was the finest officer I had during the war. Intelligent, dutiful, loyal. Everything we trained them to be at the academy." "Was he with you on Ralroost?" "Early on, yes. He was with us at Aether, though by the time you rejoined us, Commander, he had his own ship and was fighting the U.S. in Vong on the Mid and Outer Rim. He saw many horrible things there. We all saw horrible things during the war. From what I saw of him, he still seemed like a model officer. That's why I had a hard time figuring out why he, of all the beings in the galaxy, went off to exterminate the Vong. We checked into his record. His family was on Botho the whole time, and they weren't harmed. Was there something specific that happened in the Outer Rim?" Christie looked down at his paws and gave a long, heavy sigh. "Commander, what I am about to tell you is very personal. I would prefer if it doesn't leave this room." "All right." Jagged stiffened. "Go on." "Ben was not just my finest officer. He was almost my family." "Your family?" "The Crefties are an illustrious clan," the old Bothan said. "Many seek to marry into it in the hopes of basking in the favors our good name provides. But Ben wasn't like that. He was very much in love with Evan. My sister." Jagged searched his memory. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had a sister." "Of course not. You were on the far side of the galaxy when she died on Coruscant." "Oh, I'm sorry, Admiral." "I'm no admiral," Christie shook his head. "But I was, of course, when I introduced Evan to my fine subordinate. Things progressed quickly. They became both very much in love." "You're saying something changed in him after the fall of Coruscant?" "Something changed in all of us," Christie said firmly. His violet eyes flicked up to hold Jagged's. "When the Bothan government declared Arcray total war against the U.S. in Vong, I was overjoyed. I wanted to make them pay for what they'd done to Coruscant, to Evan, even to my cousin. The combined clan's declaration was beautiful, because it lifted any cloak of moral responsibility and unleashed the inner predator within our race. I remember, Jack said evenly. For most of time he spent aboard Ralroost, Creffy had been an exuberant force, urging his men and women to hurt the U.S. Hinvong through any means possible. It had definitely helped overall morale, but inside Jag had shared the moral qualms his Jedi friends had expressed more openly. Creffy exhaled. The responsibilities of command and the quandary of putting an end to the war with minimal bloodshed forced me to temper the bloodlust I once had. Other Bothans, Bryn among them, continued to cultivate the race hatred of Arcray within their hearts. Not just Bothans, Jagged said. Hate is a hard thing to let go of. Not just hate, Creffy's eyes flared again. What of your sister, Commander Fell? What of the secret she has locked away in Celestial's laboratory? Do you think those chismetics down on Zanima Second brought the Alpha Red agent with them? She's given me assurance that she will not use it without consulting me first. And do you trust your sister? I also told her I would shoot her down if she tried. Answer my question. Do you trust her? His jaw clamped shut. He knew the answer, but it hurt too much to say it. Creffy shook his head. Evan and I were quite different, but we trusted one another. Those two Antilles girls, they trust each other. And love each other very deeply, I think. Jag didn't know if he loved Weinson. He had once, when he'd been the strict one, and she'd been the keeper of his free spirit. Now the situation was reversed, or something close, and he did not like the parts of his past that seemed to have flowered in his sister. He said, we were not raised in a society that places value on love. Nor was I, Creffy nodded. But we do not have to be what our people expect us to be. We make our own choices. You and me, and Bryn. I know, Jagged exhaled a long, painful breath he hadn't known he was holding. What about Arefja? When the time comes, when you and he meet again, what choice do you think he will make? I don't know, Creffy said sadly, but I am prepared to do whatever I have to for the sake of my mission. Jag nodded in wordless agreement. That was something he shared with Creffy, and with his sister too. She stood on the grassy hilltop, bare feet on soft damp earth, and wondered if she belonged here. Tahiri Veila had called a lot of places home. Tatooine, Yavin 4, Ossus, even Coruscant, though the busy city world had never felt like a place where she belonged. She'd spent 5 years on Zanima Second, helping Danny Kui and Horror bring peace to a shattered society, while she helped mend together her shattered self. Looking back, things had all started going downhill when she left Zanima Second. Ever since she'd left, she'd been overcome by the desire to get back. Not just to the planet, but back further still, to those brief moments of youth when she'd had Anakin at her side and she capable of taking on the U.S. Hinvong and the entire galaxy, so long as they were together. That overwhelming need to get back had pulled her ever deeper into desperation and darkness, and made her do things the Tahiri whom Anakin had loved would never have condoned. Now she was here again. So much had changed, both on the planet and inside herself, but it still felt so very peaceful to stand on the crest of the hill overlooking the middle distance, admiring the endless rolling hills draped in bora trees, the gleam of distant lakes, the lazy passing of fat white clouds across a vast blue sky. It was almost enough to make her forget the things she'd done since she last stood here. Almost. Jaina had left that morning for the hyperdrives, taken with her Mando buddies and most of Wraith Squadron. That left Tahiri in town with Danny, Horror, and most troubling of all, Ben Skywalker. Ben himself wasn't troubled, not anymore. That was what troubled Tahiri. He'd explained to her and Jaina both the encounter he'd had in the forest, first with Zanima Second materialized as a child, and then with his deceased mother. He'd been certain, dead certain, that the image of Mara Jade had been a real Force specter, not another projection of Second's. Somehow she must have been summoned by the living planet itself. And that was worrying on many levels. If Second had summoned the ghost of Mara Jade Skywalker, perhaps pulling on some tether of their previous meeting, who else would follow? Jaina Solo, the enigmatic Vergier. Was it possible, however unlikely, that the planet might summon the ghost of Anakin Solo. The very thought had made Tahiri's chest tighten. She'd gone for a long walk to sort out her thoughts, but as she stared at the forests and hills, cool breeze stinging her face, she was no closer to an answer. She didn't know which she'd prefer, seeing Anakin or not seeing him. He'd been the bright center of her life, and everything since his death, even the 5 years of healing on Zanima II, had been poisoned by his bittersweet memory. Their brief time as lovers, between the fall of Yavin 4 and the mission to Mirkor, had been the peak of her life, and everything else was just a long downhill walk, constantly looking over her shoulder at the heights she'd climbed down from. How could she face Anakin, after all the things she'd done? How could she tell him what Jaina Solo had turned into, let alone what horrible things Tahiri had done to help Anakin's brother? How could she explain that she had killed and tortured and betrayed the people who loved her, all because of her awful desperate need just to spend a little more time with the boy she'd loved half a life ago? Anakin would probably forgive her. Anakin could forgive everything. He was greater even than Ben Skywalker in his capacity for understanding, love, and forgiveness. Tahiri did not have that capability. Regret, like the memory of Anakin, was just something she had to live with now. The soft earth was still a comfort beneath her bare feet. When she'd first come to Yavin 4 to train as a Jedi, she'd insisted on going everywhere barefoot, even the messy jungle. It was something she'd never experienced on Tatooine, and every step brought new sensation, discovery. Growing older, she'd slowly weaned herself off the practice, and after joining herself with Nan Yim's implanted memories, she'd given it up entirely. But over time, she started going barefoot again. She hadn't thought much about it at first, but looking back she realized it must have been an unconscious attempt to get back just a bit of what she lost from her youth, a minor, benign version of the same urge that had dragged her down Darth Kedus's wake. Realizing that, she tried to get back in the habit of wearing boots again, but right here, right now, on this grassy hilltop, it felt wrong not to touch this world any way she could. She was pondering the beautiful scene when she heard someone call her name behind her. She turned and looked down the hill toward the town. A tall blonde woman, hair bound at the nape of her neck, was walking toward her, followed by a U.S. Hinvong dressed not in the organic fibers or light armor common to his people, but a synthetic gray jumpsuit. Picking up her boots with one hand, Tahiri stepped off the hilltop and walked down the slope. A large cloud passed overhead, obscuring the sun. "There you are," Jesmyn Taynor said. "I heard you were still in town." "It's good to see you again," both of you, Tahiri said, and she meant it. On board Starless, she'd spent time with both Jesmyn and the human-raised U.S. Hinvong, Scud. She found herself identifying with Jesmyn's wandering life, Jedi dropout, Antarian ranger, bounty hunter, Wraith operative, and with Scud's conflicted human U.S. Hinvong nature, and was glad to have both of them here. Besides, they were a distraction from worrying about the dead. "I thought most of your people went with Jaina," she said. "They did." Jesmyn put her hands on her hips, nudging the lightsaber attached to her belt. "It's just us. Shar wanted me to watch the comm system while Scud got acquainted." Tahiri looked at the U.S. Hinvong. She had half a guess as to what he was feeling now, like he was at once coming home and wandering into something more alien than he could possibly imagine. She asked, "Well, how is it?" Scud's face, gray and smooth, bereft of the tattoos and scars typical of his people, seemed even more childlike as he looked around the hillside. Finally, his eyes settled on Tahiri, and he said, "I should have come a long time ago." She smiled and crossed her arms over her chest. "Well, you're here now. What do you think?" "I think I have so much to learn. I have spent some time on one of their Demudex, with some of their shapers. They have been working to stabilize the biosphere after the damage from the last jump. The things they've discovered, comparing second in biology to U.S. Hinvong life, it is fascinating. I'm surprised more scientists did not come here before." The U.S. Hinvong liked their privacy, Tahiri reminded him. "So does Sekit." "Yes, I understand." Scud looked a little sullen. "They are unsure what to do with me. I am like them, but not like them at all. And they seem strange to me as well. That's only natural, Tahiri said softly. But they are part of you. Even the things that seem strange are ugly. Denying that can only hurt you. Believe me. I do. And I think I am getting used to it slowly. Well, relax, Jessamine grinned. You've only been here less than a day. Who knows how much time we will have? Scott looked up at the clouds drifting overhead, like he was trying to see the stars and the fleets beyond. Come on, Tahiri said as a strong breeze chilled her. Let's go back to the town. They agreed, and after Tahiri put her boots on, they walked down the hill through the long blowing grass until they were amidst the clusters of low-domed buildings. They had been grown with no discernible pattern. The streets were winding and haphazard, usually unpaved. It was unlike Coruscant in every way, and that was enough to make Tahiri feel better. When they returned to Danny Key's building, they found the Magister sitting down on the floor, talking quietly to Horror and Ben. The red-haired young man looked up and asked, "Where'd you find her?" "Up on a hill, taking in the view," Jessamine replied. "Did you need me for something?" Tahiri asked, looking from Danny to Horror. The old Yuuzhan Vong priest bobbed his head. "Perhaps. We were speaking with your young friend, Scott, about Shaper's matters." "The Magister is very knowledgeable," Scott nodded. "Well, I was a scientist in a past life," Danny laughed softly. "I thought you were an astrophysicist," Ben said. "I was," Danny said. Her smile wilted. "Then I had to adapt." "The Magister was the first of your galaxy to encounter the Preterite Vong," Horror said grimly. "At least, the only one of that initial group to survive. The fact that she has found it in her heart to forgive us, to stay with us." Danny reached out and placed a palm on his gray brittle hand. "It's all right. I'm happy with what happened." Tahiri wasn't sure about that. Danny betrayed palpable irritation at having been ignored by Sekit, and clearly blamed herself in part for the departure of the True Honor faction. Despite all that, the smile on her face was genuine. There was no place in the galaxy Danny Kui would rather be than Zanima Sekit. Tahiri took a seat on the carpet. Ben and Danny scooted slightly to make room for Scott and Jessamine. "So," Tahiri asked, "what did you need me for?" "A possibility has occurred to us." Horror fixed her with his dark, deep-set eyes. "I trust Jaina Solo and your technicians from the Alliance to fix the hyperdrive machinery. However, that may not be enough." Tahiri raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "This world is part natural, part mechanical," Scott said. "Everything stays in balance. It works despite those differences. Those hyperdrives might not work unless the natural and the biological are working in sync." "Haven't your shapers already looked at the hyperdrive?" "They have," said Harar, "and they are at the site now. However, just as our working mechanics were not enough, so our shapers might need additional help." Tahiri stared at Scott. The Yuuzhan Vong was a brilliant amateur biologist, but he only had a day's experience with Zanima Sekit. Sensing her thoughts, Scott shook his head. "Not me. She suggested we find someone else. Someone hard to get to." Tahiri's jaw dropped. She stared at Horror. "You can't be serious." "Not her." Horror nodded. "She is our most brilliant shaper." "She's a war criminal," Tahiri said harshly. As the last master shaper during the Yuuzhan Vong War, Keela Quad had created horrible monstrosities that claimed thousands of Alliance lives, most notably the horrible armored Slayer soldiers who had defended Shimmer's palace. Beneath her obvious revulsion, Tahiri held a still deeper resentment to Keela Quad. It had been her relative, Mezhin Quad, who had captured Tahiri on Yavin 4 all those years ago, cut into her brain, and filled it with the memories of so-called Rena Quad. Tahiri had thanked her by cutting her head from her shoulders. "Keela Quad was a great help to us immediately after the war," Horror reminded her. "She helped grow new towns like the one we are in now. For a couple years. Then she went crazy and wandered off into the mountains. Do we even know where she is?" "We have reports," Danny spoke up. "It seems that she hadn't left her Demutech in the Blue Mountains in over 10 years. Sith spawn. Tahiri shook her head. Traipsing through the forest to try and recruit a mad shaper, one who had already brought so much pain to the galaxy, was not what she expected to be doing today. Honestly, I'd have thought she'd have joined True Honor. Not her, Har said. It was her successor as Master Shaper, Vilith. Tahiri remembered him. Tall, proud, intelligent. He'd also kept to himself, and Tahiri had never gotten a good read on him. Do you know if he had any contact with Kila Quad before he left with True Honor? She asked. None that we could see, Danny said, then added, I admit we could have kept better watch on him, though. What's past is past, Har consoled. Right now we have to look to the future. And the future involves Kila Quad. Asked Tahiri, still skeptical. It well might, said Har. Our situation is dire. I believe it is worth trying. Tahiri looked to Danny for appeal, but the Magister nodded in agreement. Okay, Tahiri sighed. She looked at Scott. Pack your kit, then. I guess we're going on a trip. We will send a guide with you, said Harar. Be my guest. Tahiri rose to her feet, as did Scott and Jessamine. As Ben stood up, he asked, where do I fit in all this? You should stay in town, Ben, Tahiri said, and glanced at Jessamine. You too. Watch over the comm system. Help Danny and Hara with whatever they need. Keep in touch with Jaina. Sounds good, Jessamine nodded. She clearly had no desire to go trekking through the Blue Mountains. As the four of them started for the door, Danny said, Tahiri, could you wait a moment? Tahiri had a feeling this conversation was also going to be awkward, but she said, sure. Go on ahead, guys. Scud, I'll meet you at the comm center. Scud nodded and left. Jessamine followed, then Ben. Tahiri watched his face for some hint of the coming conversation, but he seemed to know nothing. When they were gone, she sat back down on the carpet with Danny and Har. Well, she asked, placing her hands on her knees. We have heard from Ben that he saw his mother in the forest, Danny said evenly. He said that Sekit appeared as a child and guided him to her. If that's what Ben says, I believe him. Danny nodded, though she looked unhappy that Sekit had, again, appeared to manifest itself to someone other than her. She said, Tahiri, what happened to Mara Jade? What happened to Jaina Solo? There was the obvious question, the one she knew was coming but prayed she wouldn't have to answer. But now Danny and Hara were staring at her, expectant, needing. She had no right to hide this information from them. She trusted them with her life. She could certainly trust them with the truth, even an awful one. Please, said Harar. Tell us how such great Jedi could fall. Tahiri closed her eyes, exhaled. Then she told them everything. She told them about how Jason had changed after his 5-year journey to discover new things about the Force. She spoke of the Swarm War, and how he'd tricked his fellow Jedi into a preemptive attack on the Chiss. Then came the Corellian Crisis and the Second Civil War. She talked about how Jason had trained Ben in the Galactic Alliance Guard, taking him on secret police raids. She said that Jason sought to bring peace to the galaxy by apprenticing himself to a Sith named Lumia, and that when Mara Jade found out, she went after Jason to kill him. Jason had, in turn, killed his aunt and become Darth Ketis. Then she told how them Ketis had taken control of the Alliance, turning it into an instrument of terror just like his grandfather had, until he was hunted down and killed by his own sister. The one bright light in all of this was Jason's daughter Alana, born from his hidden lover and childhood friend Tenno Ka. Tahiri did not talk about her own role in this, how her desire to see Anakin and her longtime friendship with Jason had turned her into a Sith who murdered old men and helpless prisoners. She could only say so much. When she was done, Danny Kui was weeping silently. Hera's eyes were black marbles in his ashen face. Now you understand, she told them. Her eyes and throat were dry. Jaina doesn't talk about him ever. Ben's strong, but he's lost so much. I had no idea, Danny croaked. I wish I could have seen him one last time. I wish I could have told him. Tahiri only nodded. The pain of words left unsaid had haunted her half her life. It all makes sense now, a soft voice said behind them. All three heads spun to see a teenage girl with 3 scars on her forehead perched on one of the shelves jutting from the Demutic wall. Tahiri stared. It was her, and yet not. 15 years ago, when she first come here, she had been battered but unbroken, confused but seeking clarity, hopeful despite all she'd lost. She'd been smooth-skinned and bright-eyed and barefooted. Staring at the image before her was like seeing the clock turn back on half her life. Second, Danny's voice broke. She sounded like she was about to cry again. You're back. You're really? The image of young Tahiri held up a hand. It's all right, Danny. Really. I haven't forgotten you. Something rattled in Tahiri's chest. It felt so strange to hear your own voice. What I thought, Danny stuttered. You just went away, and I thought you were angry. Or, I'm sad, the living world said. There's so much in this universe to be sad about. So much hatred, pain, loss. None of it is fair. But we have to keep moving, or we'll be stuck in the past forever. Second, Tahiri said, then froze. She wanted to know why the living world had chosen her image to appear as. The image of her past self, still unbroken by Darth Ketis, filled her with awful, aching nostalgia to go back to what was. Standing before her now was the image of everything she'd longed to return to for the past 15 years, everything she'd gone dark in the hope of getting back. How did you bring forth the ghost of Mara Jade Skywalker? Horror asked behind her. You can't see her. Tahiri jerked in shock. Second projected images through the Force. Horror could not touch the Force and should not have been able to see this projection. In the past, whenever Second had wished to speak to the U.S. Hanvong, it had spoken directly through the mouths of Danny or the old Magister, Jabba. Tahiri watched her younger self chuckle and hop off the shelf. The shelf creaked with the alleviation of weight, and 2 bare feet slapped softly on the floor. That's impossible, Tahiri gaped. How did he? I've been discovering new things about myself lately, her simulacrum said. I've learned to touch the Force in new ways, even manipulate matter so my children can better see me. So, if I touched you? What about Mara J. Skywalker? Hara asked. That is something else I've been learning. The girl's face smiled ambiguously. The line between life and death is never absolute, not with the Force. Could you? Tahiri's words caught. She couldn't say it, couldn't ask it. She felt as pathetic, needy, and helpless as she had before Darth Ketis. She was like a spice addict dreaming of a fix. Just the thought, the hope of touching Anakin's spirit threatened to ruin her again. Her own face smiled knowingly. It's all right, Tahiri. And Danny, and Horror. I haven't forgotten about you. But there's so much happening, Danny said. There's a fleet out there trying to kill us. And true honor they. It doesn't matter, Second said firmly. What I'm doing is more important. More important, spat Danny. There are hundreds of thousands of beings on this planet. Beings who trust you, need you, worship you. I haven't forgotten them, the young Tahiri said. But recent trauma has awakened things in me. I can see things now. Beyond life and death, past and present, good and evil. I wonder if this is how Jason felt when he saved the galaxy from enemy. A strange, sad smile appeared on the girl's face. A dragon is coming. He won't fall easily. I have to be prepared. A dragon, Danny said. What dragon? Second, I don't understand. Don't worry, Magister, the world said. You will. And then the girl was gone. Like she'd never been there at all. An awful silence fell over the room. Danny choked back more tears. Horror lowered his head and looked very, very tired. And Tahiri did not know what to feel. Confusion, hope, desire, despair, and a painful nostalgia all warred within her. She'd come to Second thinking it might be a place of refuge from all her regrets, all she'd done in the past 5 years. Instead, it had brought her face to face with them all. Chapter 8. Well, that settles it, Mary sighed. We're borked. Jagged stood with his hands planted on his hips, scowling at the communications console. The auxiliary command room on Starless was a small space, mostly used for emergency overrides and system checks. Now that space was crammed with people. He was on his feet, next to Trace Creefy. Miri Antilles and Thames Fodrick, the Wraith Squadron communications expert, were crouched around the console from which, in theory, they should be able to start an ultra-encrypted tight beam communication with Coruscant. Miri's sister Sayal stood slightly apart. Her arms were crossed over her chest and a worried frown wrinkled her face. "I don't understand," Sayal said. "The console seems to be working." "It is," Miri sighed. "We've double and triple checked the systems. The signal is beamed via the Esfandia relay to Coruscant, correct?" Creefy asked. When Thames nodded, the Bothan said, "Well, perhaps we're simply sending it to the wrong place." "We've double and triple checked our position against the star charts the Chiss have provided us," Jack said. "The constellations are a perfect match. We know exactly where we are and where we're pointing the transmitter. We're just not getting a response." "Could something have happened on Coruscant or Esfandia?" Sayal asked gravely. "Last we heard there was some civil unrest in the capital, but nothing that could have brought down the government." Thames shook his head. "And according to Director Lauren, the system is rigged with an automated response at both stations. The only way to stop that would be to blow up one of the most secure buildings in the galaxy." "It could be something simple," Myri offered. "Some gases or weird interference that's not on our charts. Or it could be something wrong with Starless herself. She took some hurt during the fight in the nebula." "We've been communicating regularly with Jaina on Zanima Second," Jagged said, "not to mention the other ships in the fleet. Short-range and long-range transmitters use different systems," Thames said. "One could conk out without the other being affected." "I'll authorize an EV team to check the communications arrays," Sayal said. "Very good," Jag nodded. "I'll talk to Captain Pavrik and see if Coruscant Gem has better luck. I suppose I can also contact Celestial and see if they have any idea what's blocking us." The others nodded but said nothing. Conversations with Wynsa had been tense lately, but he was hoping his sister would be amenable to this simple query. Thames ran a hand through his short hair, then raised it in the air. "Okay, I've got a question. Why not jump out of the system and try a different location?" Jagged fought a frown. The thought of separating the already beleaguered Trinity fleet was unappealing from a tactical standpoint. Leaving Jaina behind on the planet was even less so. "We should double-check the communications arrays first." Sayal came to his rescue. "We can make more informed decisions after that." "Agreed," Creefy nodded and looked at Jag. "What is the latest update from the planet?" "Our techs have just taken a preliminary review of the damaged hyperdrive system. I think Jaina's going to head out there and help." "And the communications?" asked Thames. "Short range is workable. Our people are also installing a long-range beacon that will, hopefully, allow us to keep tabs on the planet for years to come." "Sounds good to me," Mary sighed. "Then we won't have to chase this criffing thing down every other decade." "Indeed," Creefy grunted. "Well, we should begin survey work. I'll get an EV crew ready." Sayal looked at the two Wraiths. "I'll let you know when they're out. You can help provide diagnostics from this end." "Aye, Captain," Mary tipped her sister an informal salute. Sayal nodded in reply, then walked out of the room. Creefy followed, and Jag followed him. When he got into the hallway, Sayal was already walking ahead at a clipped, determined pace. Jagged was still not used to how unlike the Antilles sisters were. Myri, with her multicolored hair, casual demeanor, and party girl reputation, stood in stark contrast to Sayal's sober military reserve. It was a strange comparison to Jag's own sister. When he was young, he had been the determined, professional soldier, while Wynn had exhibited a wild free spirit rarely seen in Chiss society. Jagged had never considered himself wild or free-spirited, but 20 years later Wynn seemed to see him that way, while she herself acted like the perfect Chiss naval officer. It didn't feel like their roles had been reversed, not exactly, but they had certainly changed. He thought, with a tinge of sadness, that things might have been different if Davin, Cheris, Chak, or Sem had survived. All of them, some of them, any of them, it didn't matter. Maybe then his family would seem less broken. "You seem pensive," Christie muttered. Jag realized he'd slowed his pace as he walked down the hall. "Sorry. Just feeling a little weak." "Do you feel you've recovered from your ordeal on Phoenix?" Christie asked. "As much as possible, I mean." Jag resisted the urge to touch the black patch strapped over his left eye. The patch still itched sometimes, and the strap pinched the skin of his forehead. His vision seemed strangely flat also, and he had to crane his head to the left more often. He would probably get used to it all eventually, just like his father had. He didn't know why the thought made him uneasy. "I'm managing," Jag said at last. Thankfully, Christie was walking on his right side. "I'm still hoping to get a prosthetic once this is all over." "Of course," Christie said. The old Bothan looked like he wanted to say more, then trailed off. "Are you all right?" Jag asked. He didn't know how to approach Christie. 15 years ago he'd served under the Bothan, looked up to him as an exemplary commander. Now his tactical mind still seemed sharp, but time had worn away the charisma and vigor that had made him such a good admiral. He was half hoping Christie would brush aside his query, just as he had Creffy's. Instead, as they drew closer to the turbolift, the ex-admiral said, "May we talk in private, Commander?" Of course, Jag nodded. When the elevator arrived, he punched in the deck where his ready room was located. The two of them rode to their destination in awkward silence. Jag's ready room was about a quarter of the size of his office as Imperial Head of State, but he liked it more. The desk, the shelf of datapads, and the soft-back chair were plain and informal. He pulled 2 chairs in front of the desk, sat down in one, and beckoned Christie to do the same. The Bothan settled down in the chair opposite Jag. His violet eyes seemed to scour the room, resting on everything but Jag himself. "May I ask what's bothering you, Admiral?" "I'm no admiral," the Bothan shook his head. "Still," said Jag, "what is it?" Christie finally faced Jag, but his vision still hovered somewhere above the human shoulder. He asked, "When you were captive aboard Phoenix, did you talk with Bryn Arefja?" "Ah, of course." The entire reason Christie had joined them on this quest into the unknown regions was because his former protege was leading the renegade fleet. "I did speak to him, though he wasn't in the room when Boba Fett did this to me." Jag pointed to his eye patch. "That's more than I've done in, at least 4 years." Christie leaned forward. "Tell me, how did he seem?" Jagged though about that. Arefja had come to him and asked him to join the renegade fleet. It was the kind of obvious offer made to any prisoner, the carrot before the stick. When Jag refused, as they both knew he would, the stick came out. The threats of torture delivered not with malice or sadistic zest, but with the tone of reluctance. At first Jag had thought it feigned, but as he replayed the scene in memory, he began to suspect that Arefja had, in fact, been saddened and squeamish at the thought of torture. "He seemed trapped," Jag said. Creffy's ears twitched. "I don't understand." "No, not trapped. He seemed like he was scared. Like he was on a wild land speeder that was veering out of control, and he was clinging on as hard as he could, because as dangerous as the ride is, falling off would be even worse." The edges of Creffy's mouth drooped in a Bothan frown. Bryn isn't just along for the ride. He is the ride. It's his land speeder. "You haven't experienced Nadasidala," Jag said dryly. "But I think there was more than that. Can you tell me about Arefja, as you knew him?" "I've known him for some time," Christie said guardedly. "He was the finest officer I had during the war. Intelligent, dutiful, loyal. Everything we trained them to be at the academy." "Was he with you on Ralroost?" "Early on, yes. He was with us at Aether, though by the time you rejoined us, Commander, he had his own ship and was fighting the U.S. in Vong on the Mid and Outer Rim. He saw many horrible things there. We all saw horrible things during the war. From what I saw of him, he still seemed like a model officer. That's why I had a hard time figuring out why he, of all the beings in the galaxy, went off to exterminate the Vong. We checked into his record. His family was on Botho the whole time, and they weren't harmed. Was there something specific that happened in the Outer Rim? Creffy looked down at his paws and gave a long, heavy sigh. Commander, what I am about to tell you is very personal. I would prefer if it doesn't leave this room. All right. Jack stiffened. Go on. Bren was not just my finest officer. He was almost my family. Your family. The Creffys are an illustrious clan, the old Bothan said. Many seek to marry into it in the hopes of basking in the favors our good name provides. But Bren wasn't like that. He was very much in love with Evan. My sister? Jag searched his memory. I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had a sister. Of course not. You were on the far side of the galaxy when she died on Coruscant. Oh, I'm sorry, Admiral. I'm no admiral. Creefy shook his head. But I was, of course, when I introduced Evan to my fine subordinate. Things progressed quickly. They became both very much in love. You're saying something changed in him after the fall of Coruscant. Something changed in all of us, Creffy said firmly. His violet eyes flicked up to hold Jag's. When the Bothan government declared Arcray total war against the U.S. in Vong, I was overjoyed. I wanted to make them pay for what they'd done to Coruscant, to Evan, even to my cousin. The combined clan's declaration was beautiful, because it lifted any cloak of moral responsibility and unleashed the inner predator within our race. I remember, Jag said evenly. For most of time he spent aboard Rau'Roost, Creffy had been an exuberant force, urging his men and women to hurt the U.S. Hinvong through any means possible. It had definitely helped overall morale, but inside Jag had shared the moral qualms his Jedi friends had expressed more openly. Creffy exhaled. The responsibilities of command and the quandary of putting an end to the war with minimal bloodshed forced me to temper the bloodlust I once had. Other Bothans, Bren among them, continued to cultivate the race hatred of Arcray within their hearts. Not just Bothans, Jagged said. Hate is a hard thing to let go of. Not just hate, Creffy's eyes flared again. What of your sister, Commander Fell? What of the secret she has locked away in Celestial's laboratory? Do you think those chismetics down on Zanima Second brought the Alpha Red agent with them? She's given me assurance that she will not use it without consulting me first. And do you trust your sister? I also told her I would shoot her down if she tried. Answer my question. Do you trust her? His jaw clamped shut. He knew the answer, but it hurt too much to say it. Creffy shook his head. Evan and I were quite different, but we trusted one another. Those two Antilles girls, they trust each other. And love each other very deeply, I think. Jag didn't know if he loved Weinson. He had once, when he'd been the strict one, and she'd been the keeper of his free spirit. Now the situation was reversed, or something close, and he did not like the parts of his past that seemed to have flowered in his sister. He said, we were not raised in a society that places value on love. Nor was I, Creffy nodded. But we do not have to be what our people expect us to be. We make our own choices. You and me, and Bren. I know, Jagged exhaled a long, painful breath he hadn't known he was holding. What about Arefja? When the time comes, when you and he meet again, what choice do you think he will make? I don't know, Creffy said sadly, but I am prepared to do whatever I have to for the sake of my mission. Jag nodded in wordless agreement. That was something he shared with Creffy, and with his sister too. She stood on the grassy hilltop, bare feet on soft damp earth, and wondered if she belonged here. Tahiri Veila had called a lot of places home. Tatooine, Yavin 4, Ossus, even Coruscant, though the busy city world had never felt like a place where she belonged. She'd spent 5 years on Zanima Second, helping Danny Kui and Horror bring peace to a shattered society, while she helped mend together her shattered self. Looking back, things had all started going downhill when she left Zanima Second. Ever since she'd left, she'd been overcome by the desire to get back. Not just to the planet, but back further still, to those brief moments of youth when she'd had Anakin at her side and she capable of taking on the U.S. Hinvong and the entire galaxy, so long as they were together. That overwhelming need to get back had pulled her ever deeper into desperation and darkness, and made her do things the Tahiri whom Anakin had loved would never have condoned. Now she was here again. So much had changed, both on the planet and inside herself, but it still felt so very peaceful to stand on the crest of the hill overlooking the middle distance, admiring the endless rolling hills draped in bora trees, the gleam of distant lakes, the lazy passing of fat white clouds across a vast blue sky. It was almost enough to make her forget the things she'd done since she last stood here. Almost. Jaina had left that morning for the hyperdrives, taking with her Mando buddies and most of Wraith Squadron. That left Tahiri in town with Danny, horror, and most troubling of all, Ben Skywalker. Ben himself wasn't troubled, not anymore. That was what troubled Tahiri. He'd explained to her and Jaina both the encounter he'd had in the forest, first with Zanima second materialized as a child, and then with his deceased mother. He'd been certain, dead certain, that the image of Mara Jade had been a real Force specter, not another projection of seconds. Somehow she must have been summoned by the living planet itself. And that was worrying on many levels. If Sekit had summoned the ghost of Mara Jade Skywalker, perhaps pulling on some tether of their previous meeting, who else would follow? Jaina Solo, the enigmatic Vergir. Was it possible, however unlikely, that the planet might summon the ghost of Anakin Solo? The very thought had made Tahiri's chest tighten. She'd gone for a long walk to sort out her thoughts, but as she stared at the forests and hills, cool breeze stinging her face, she was no closer to an answer. She didn't know which she'd prefer, seeing Anakin or not seeing him. He'd been the bright center of her life, and everything since his death, even the 5 years of healing on Zanima Sekit, had been poisoned by his bittersweet memory. Their brief time as lovers, between the fall of Yavin 4 and the mission to Mirkor, had been the peak of her life, and everything else was just a long downhill walk, constantly looking over her shoulder at the heights she'd climbed down from. How could she face Anakin, after all the things she'd done? How could she tell him what Jaina Solo had turned into, let alone what horrible things Tahiri had done to help Anakin's brother? How could she explain that she had killed and tortured and betrayed the people who loved her, all because of her awful desperate need just to spend a little more time with the boy she'd loved half a life ago? Anakin would probably forgive her. Anakin could forgive everything. He was greater even than Ben Skywalker in his capacity for understanding, love, and forgiveness. Tahiri did not have that capability. Regret, like the memory of Anakin, was just something she had to live with now. The soft earth was still a comfort beneath her bare feet. When she'd first come to Yavin 4 to train as a Jedi, she'd insisted on going everywhere barefoot, even the messy jungle. It was something she'd never experienced on Tatooine, and every step brought new sensation, discovery. Growing older, she'd slowly weaned herself off the practice, and after joining herself with Nan Yim's implanted memories, she'd given it up entirely. But over time, she started going barefoot again. She hadn't thought much about it at first, but looking back she realized it must have been an unconscious attempt to get back just a bit of what she'd lost from her youth, a minor, benign version of the same urge that had dragged her down Darth Kedus's wake. Realizing that, she tried to get back in the habit of wearing boots again, but right here, right now, on this grassy hilltop, it felt wrong not to touch this world any way she could. She was pondering the beautiful scene when she heard someone call her name behind her. She turned and looked down the hill toward the town. A tall blonde woman, hair bound at the nape of her neck, was walking toward her, followed by a U.S. Hinvong dressed not in the organic fibers or light armor common to his people, but a synthetic gray jumpsuit. Picking up her boots with one hand, Tahiri stepped off the hilltop and walked down the slope. A large cloud passed overhead, obscuring the sun. "There you are," Jesmyn Tainer said. "I heard you were still in town." "It's good to see you again," both of you, Tahiri said, and she meant it. On board Starless, she'd spent time with both Jesmyn and the human-raised U.S. Hinvong, Scud. She found herself identifying with Jesmyn's wandering life, Jedi dropout, Antarian ranger, bounty hunter, Wraith operative, and with Scud's conflicted human U.S. Hinvong nature, and was glad to have both of them here, Besides, they were a distraction from worrying about the dead. I thought most of your people went with Jaina, she said. They did. Jasmine put her hands on her hips, nudging the lightsaber attached to her belt. It's just us. Shar wanted me to watch the comm system while Scott got acquainted. Tahiri looked at the Yuuzhan Vong. She had half a guess as to what he was feeling now, like he was at once coming home and wandering into something more alien than he could possibly imagine. She asked, "Well, how is it?" Scott's face, gray and smooth, bereft of the tattoos and scars typical of his people, seemed even more childlike as he looked around the hillside. Finally, his eyes settled on Tahiri, and he said, "I should have come a long time ago." She smiled and crossed her arms over her chest. "Well, you're here now. What do you think?" "I think I have so much to learn. I have spent some time on one of their demudex with some of their shapers. They have been working to stabilize the biosphere after the damage from the last jump. The things they've discovered, comparing second in biology to Yuuzhan Vong life, it is fascinating. I'm surprised more scientists did not come here before." The Yuuzhan Vong like their privacy, Tahiri reminded him. So does Sekit. "Yes, I understand." Scott looked a little sullen. "They are unsure what to do with me. I am like them, but not like them at all. And they seem strange to me as well." "That's only natural," Tahiri said softly. "But they are part of you. Even the things that seem strange are ugly. Denying that can only hurt you. Believe me." "I do. And I think I am getting used to it slowly." "Well, relax," Jasmine grinned. "You've only been here less than a day. Who knows how much time we will have?" Scott looked up at the clouds drifting overhead, like he was trying to see the stars and the fleets beyond. "Come on," Tahiri said as a strong breeze chilled her. "Let's go back to the town." They agreed, and after Tahiri put her boots on, they walked down the hill through the long blowing grass until they were amidst the clusters of low-domed buildings. They had been grown with no discernible pattern. The streets were winding and haphazard, usually unpaved. It was unlike Coruscant in every way, and that was enough to make Tahiri feel better. When they returned to Danny Key's building, they found the Magister sitting down on the floor, talking quietly to Horror and Ben. The red-haired young man looked up and asked, "Where'd you find her?" "Up on a hill, taking in the view," Jasmine replied. "Did you need me for something?" Tahiri asked, looking from Danny to Horror. The old Yuuzhan Vong priest bobbed his head. "Perhaps. We were speaking with your young friend, Scott, about Shaper's matters." "The Magister is very knowledgeable," Scott nodded. "Well, I was a scientist in a past life," Danny laughed softly. "I thought you were an astrophysicist," Ben said. "I was," Danny said. Her smile wilted. "Then I had to adapt. The Magister was the first of your galaxy to encounter the Preterite Vong," Horror said grimly. "At least, the only one of that initial group to survive. The fact that she has found it in her heart to forgive us, to stay with us." Danny reached out and placed a palm on his gray brittle hand. "It's all right. I'm happy with what happened." Tahiri wasn't sure about that. Danny betrayed palpable irritation at having been ignored by Sekit, and clearly blamed herself in part for the departure of the True Honor faction. Despite all that, the smile on her face was genuine. There was no place in the galaxy Danny Kui would rather be than Zanima Sekit. Tahiri took a seat on the carpet. Ben and Danny scooted slightly to make room for Scott and Jasmine. "So," Tahiri asked, "what did you need me for?" "A possibility has occurred to us." Horror fixed her with his dark, deep-set eyes. "I trust Jaina Solo and your technicians from the Alliance to fix the hyperdrive machinery. However, that may not be enough." Tahiri raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "This world is part natural, part mechanical," Scott said. "Everything stays in balance. It works despite those differences. Those hyperdrives might not work unless the natural and the biological are working in sync." "Haven't your shapers already looked at the hyperdrive?" "They have," said Harar, "and they are at the site now. However, just as our working mechanics were not enough, so our shapers might need additional help. Tahiri stared at Scott. The U.S. Hand Vong was a brilliant amateur biologist, but he only had a day's experience with Zanima II. Sensing her thoughts, Scott shook his head. Not me. She suggested we find someone else. Someone hard to get to. Tahiri's jaw dropped. She stared at Horror. You can't be serious. Not her. Horror nodded. She is our most brilliant shaper. She's a war criminal, Tahiri said harshly. As the last master shaper during the U.S. Hand Vong War, Keela Quad had created horrible monstrosities that claimed thousands of Alliance lives, most notably the horrible armored Slayer soldiers who had defended Shimmer's palace. Beneath her obvious revulsion, Tahiri held a still deeper resentment to Keela Quad. It had been her relative, Mezhin Quad, who had captured Tahiri on Yavin 4 all those years ago, cut into her brain, and filled it with the memories of so-called Rena Quad. Tahiri had thanked her by cutting her head from her shoulders. Keela Quad was a great help to us immediately after the war, Horror reminded her. She helped grow new towns like the one we are in now. For a couple years. Then she went crazy and wandered off into the mountains. Do we even know where she is? We have reports, Danny spoke up. It seems that she hadn't left her Demudek in the Blue Mountains in over 10 years. Sith spawn. Tahiri shook her head. Traipsing through the forest to try and recruit a mad shaper, one who had already brought so much pain to the galaxy, was not what she expected to be doing today. Honestly, I'd have thought she'd have joined True Honor. Not her, Horror said. It was her successor as Master Shaper, Vilith Dao. Tahiri remembered him. Tall, proud, intelligent. He'd also kept to himself, and Tahiri had never gotten a good read on him. Do you know if he had any contact with Keela Quad before he left with True Honor? She asked. None that we could see, Danny said, then added, I admit we could have kept better watch on him, though. What's past is past, Horror consoled. Right now we have to look to the future. And the future involves Keela Quad. Asked Tahiri, still skeptical. It well might, said Horror. Our situation is dire. I believe it is worth trying. Tahiri looked to Danny for appeal, but the Magister nodded in agreement. Okay, Tahiri sighed. She looked at Scott. Pack your kit, then. I guess we're going on a trip. We will send a guide with you, said Harar. Be my guest. Tahiri rose to her feet, as did Scott and Jessamine. As Ben stood up, he asked, where do I fit in all this? You should stay in town, Ben, Tahiri said, and glanced at Jessamine. You too. Watch over the comm system. Help Danny and Horror with whatever they need. Keep in touch with Jaina. Sounds good, Jessamine nodded. She clearly had no desire to go trekking through the Blue Mountains. As the four of them started for the door, Danny said, Tahiri, could you wait a moment? Tahiri had a feeling this conversation was also going to be awkward, but she said, sure. Go on ahead, guys. Scud, I'll meet you at the comm center. Scud nodded and left. Jessamine followed, then Ben. Tahiri watched his face for some hint of the coming conversation, but he seemed to know nothing. When they were gone, she sat back down on the carpet with Danny and Horror. Well, she asked, placing her hands on her knees. We have heard from Ben that he saw his mother in the forest, Danny said evenly. He said that Sekit appeared as a child and guided him to her. If that's what Ben says, I believe him. Danny nodded, though she looked unhappy that Sekit had, again, appeared to manifest itself to someone other than her. She said, Tahiri, what happened to Mara Jade? What happened to Jaina Solo? There was the obvious question, the one she knew was coming but prayed she wouldn't have to answer. But now Danny and Horror were staring at her, expectant, needing. She had no right to hide this information from them. She trusted them with her life. She could certainly trust them with the truth, even an awful one. Please, said Harar. Tell us how such great Jedi could fall. Tahiri closed her eyes, exhaled. Then she told them everything. She told them about how Jason had changed after his 5-year journey to discover new things about the Force. She spoke of the Swarm War, and how he'd tricked his fellow Jedi into a preemptive attack on the Chiss. Then came the Corellian Crisis and the Second Civil War. She talked about how Jacen had trained Ben in the Galactic Alliance Guard, taking him on secret police raids. She said that Jacen sought to bring peace to the galaxy by apprenticing himself to a Sith named Lumiya, and that when Mara Jade found out, she went after Jacen to kill him. Jacen had, in turn, killed his aunt and become Darth Ketis. Then she told how them Ketis had taken control of the Alliance, turning it into an instrument of terror just like his grandfather had, until he was hunted down and killed by his own sister. The one bright light in all of this was Jacen's daughter Alana, born from his hidden lover and childhood friend Tenno Ka. Tahiri did not talk about her own role in this, how her desire to see Anakin and her longtime friendship with Jacen had turned her into a Sith who murdered old men and helpless prisoners. She could only say so much. When she was done, Danny Kui was weeping silently. Hera's eyes were black marbles in his ashen face. Now you understand, she told them. Her eyes and throat were dry. Jaina doesn't talk about him ever. Ben's strong, but he's lost so much. I had no idea, Danny croaked. I wish I could have seen him one last time. I wish I could have told him. Tahiri only nodded. The pain of words left unsaid had haunted her half her life. It all makes sense now, a soft voice said behind them. All three heads spun to see a teenage girl with 3 scars on her forehead perched on one of the shelves jutting from the Demutic wall. Tahiri stared. It was her, and yet not. 15 years ago, when she'd first come here, she had been battered but unbroken, confused but seeking clarity, hopeful despite all she'd lost. She'd been smooth-skinned and bright-eyed and barefooted. Staring at the image before her was like seeing the clock turn back on half her life. Second, Danny's voice broke. She sounded like she was about to cry again. You're back? You're really? The image of young Tahiri held up a hand. It's all right, Danny. Really. I haven't forgotten you. Something rattled in Tahiri's chest. It felt so strange to hear your own voice. What I thought, Danny stuttered. You just went away, and I thought you were angry. Or, I'm sad, the living world said. There's so much in this universe to be sad about. So much hatred, pain, loss. None of it is fair. But we have to keep moving, or we'll be stuck in the past forever. Second, Tahiri said, then froze. She wanted to know why the living world had chosen her image to appear as. The image of her past self, still unbroken by Darth Ketis, filled her with awful, aching nostalgia to go back to what was. Standing before her now was the image of everything she'd longed to return to for the past 15 years, everything she'd gone dark in the hope of getting back. How did you bring forth the ghost of Mara Jade Skywalker? Hara asked behind her. You can't see her. Tahiri jerked in shock. Second projected images through the Force. Hara could not touch the Force and should not have been able to see this projection. In the past, whenever Sekhet had wished to speak to the Yuuzhan Vong, it had spoken directly through the mouths of Danny or the old Magister, Jabba. Tahiri watched her younger self chuckle and hop off the shelf. The shelf creaked with the alleviation of weight, and 2 bare feet slapped softly on the floor. That's impossible, Tahiri gaped. How did he? I've been discovering new things about myself lately, her simulacrum said. I've learned to touch the Force in new ways, even manipulate matter so my children can better see me. So, if I touched you? What about Mara Jade Skywalker? Hara asked. That is something else I've been learning. The girl's face smiled ambiguously. The line between life and death is never absolute, not with the Force. Could you? Tahiri's words caught. She couldn't say it, couldn't ask it. She felt as pathetic, needy, and helpless as she had before Darth Ketis. She was like a spice addict dreaming of a fix. Just the thought, the hope of touching Anakin's spirit threatened to ruin her again. Her own face smiled knowingly. It's all right, Tahiri. And Danny, and Hara. I haven't forgotten about you. But there's so much happening, Danny said. There's a fleet out there trying to kill us. and true honor they? It doesn't matter, Sekit said firmly. What I'm doing is more important. More important, spat Danny. There are hundreds of thousands of beings on this planet. Beings who trust you, need you, worship you. I haven't forgotten them, the young Tahiri said. But recent trauma has awakened things in me. I can see things now. Beyond life and death, past and present, good and evil. I wonder if this is how Jason felt when he saved the galaxy from enemy. A strange, sad smile appeared on the girl's face. A dragon is coming. He won't fall easily. I have to be prepared. A dragon, Danny said. What dragon? Sekit, I don't understand. Don't worry, Magister, the world said. You will. And then the girl was gone. Like she'd never been there at all. An awful silence fell over the room. Danny choked back more tears. Horror lowered his head and looked very, very tired. And Tahiri did not know what to feel. Confusion, hope, desire, despair, and a painful nostalgia all warred within her. She'd come to Sekit thinking it might be a place of refuge from all her regrets, all she'd done in the past 5 years. Instead, it had brought her face to face with them all. Chapter 9. For some time after joining the True Honor movement, Master Shaper Vilith Dal had been uncertain as to whether this was the correct path for him. It was hardly a choice that could be made, and he had no intention of slinking back to Zanima Sekit and begging forgiveness, though his fellow U.S. Vong had gone so weak on the Forest World they might actually take him back. It was, however, very plain that he was unlike the other True Honor members. For one, most of them were warriors. It was no surprise that they made up the bulk of a dissident movement aimed at taking the U.S. Vong away from the peaceful, sedentary, agricultural lives imposed on them by the Jedi on Zanima Sekit. There were no shamed ones, though they called themselves extolled now. None of the other castes paid much attention to their pretensions of equality. Some of the intended caste had joined, yes, but there were surprisingly few priests among them. High Priest Horror had done a thorough job of filling the religious hierarchy with priests who shared his vision of a peaceful life on their prison planet, this strange mocking seat of U.S. Hunter. There were a few Shapers who had joined the warriors in the True Honor movement, and only one Master Shaper who had actually taken part in the way against the Jedi 15 years ago. That Shaper was Vilith Dal. To be fair, Vilith Dal had not been a Master Shaper then. He had been an apprentice for most of the conflict and had been elevated to the full rank of Shaper on the heels of his mentor, Keela Quad, during the last stages of the fighting. As a young scientist, he had been thrilled to assist her in developing the Slayers, the elite bioengineered warriors who had valiantly defending U.S. Hunter against the Jedi invasion. All of his life he had been driven not by the warrior's bloodlust, the priest's fanaticism, or the intendant's ambition. He'd been driven by curiosity, nothing more and nothing less. Master Quad had once told him he was the ideal Shaper. In the beginning, after their forced relocation to Zanima Sekit, he had assisted as master in exploring the mysteries of this world, so like U.S. Hunter of old yet so utterly different. He'd been thrilled by this discovery, but had grown frustrated as the years went on. They could analyze every plant they found, map every genome, take apart every animal, and they still came no closer to discovering what made Zanima Sekit special. They had been forced to conclude that the mysterious power the Jedi worshipped, which the U.S. Vong were unable to touch, must have been the key. Master Quad had despaired and made herself an anchorite in the wilderness. But Vilith Dal was a born Shaper, and his curiosity was never sated. So in the end he joined True Honor, this ragged, angry movement of brutish, blood-hungry warriors, not for revenge against the Jedi, but because it offered him a chance to do something new. It was all about the company they kept. Vilith Dal now stood in the laboratory of the Sith vessel with their scientist Dishan, examining their leader's latest medical evaluation. It was beginning to feel like a second home. The first time he'd come aboard this Sith vessel, which they called Revenge, much to the warrior's approval, he'd been dazed and fascinated. He had been aboard infidel ships before, and they were nothing like this. Darth Wirelock had called it Rakuten, after the ancient race that had grown it thousands of years ago. His winding hallways, faintly luminous with the pulsing of veins and capillaries beneath his skin, recalled the insides of U.S. Hanvong ships but were also utterly different. Dishon said that this living ship existed in the dark side of the Force and was powered by it in some way. Vilith Dal had always been skeptical of the Force. He'd seen Jedi do tricks, but otherwise they seemed the same as any other being native to this galaxy. The Jedi he and Master Quad had dissected had looked the same inside as all the other humanoids they cut apart. Empirically, he could admit that the Jedi, and now the Sith, drew on some ethereal power to perform their tricks, but he was still eminently skeptical of some all-embracing energy that, if channeled properly, could both bring a planet to life and power an ancient worship. Like many Shapers, he felt the same skepticism toward the U.S. Hanvong gods, though it was a belief they rarely voiced aloud, even to each other. After spending months with Dishon aboard Revenge, he'd come to respect her knowledge and even accept some limits to his understanding. The hours spent with her, alone, had justified the decision to join True Honor. Together, they had combined their different scientific lineages and solved problems for mutual benefit. Dishon had helped him develop bias that rejuvenated the many old U.S. Hanvong warships the Sith had scoured from the far corners of the galaxy. He, in turn, worked with her to modify the Vonda Crab armor that had been grafted onto her master, Darth Krayt, during his time as a U.S. Hanvong prisoner 50 years ago. Working with Krayt had been a revelation. The Vonda Crab armor had formed a symbiosis unlike anything he'd ever seen. The living armor and the living human were at once feeding off one another yet also locked in mortal combat. The sheer willpower of Darth Krayt, and perhaps his force magic too, had kept the armor from completely taking control of his mind and body, while the armor, engrafting itself to his skin and organs, had prolonged his beyond that of a normal human. It was also helping to heal him from whatever grievous injury he had sustained. Dishon had withheld the details. If either Krayt or his armor overpowered the other, both would perish. The difference was that Krayt was a sentient being who understood limits, whereas the armor sought only to consume. Now, after filling the void in Krayt's body left by his wound, the armor seemed that it was finally, at last, getting the upper hand. Dishon and Vilith Dal both understood. They'd been trying different treatments for months, but nothing could advance the armor's parasitic advance into Krayt's body. They had explained the situation to Krayt as well, but not to any of the other Sith or U.S. Hanvong. The three of them had agreed to keep it a secret for now, lest the knowledge get out and sow discord in their fragile alliance. Working with the Sith was a joy and revelation, but Krayt's illness had also brought him face to face with something he'd been in denial of all his life. He may have been a born Shaper, but he was not a great Shaper. He knew in his heart that Master Quad could have done what he could not. She could have restored the equilibrium and saved Krayt. They reviewed the information from Krayt's most recent examination. Dishon was scanning through the data on a holographic projector. If any of the True Honor warriors saw this, they'd call Vilith Dal a blasphemer, but he didn't care. Dishon's mechanical tools were just as valid as his Casa and Vilith, sometimes Moreso. What mattered was the ends, not the means to get there. However, what they saw now was not encouraging, not at all. If this was the end they were heading for, they were doomed. How long do you think? Vilith Dal asked. The tentacles in his headdress writhed, betraying his agitation though his face was stony and cold. A week? Perhaps, Dishon said as he looked at the readout. After that he will fall into his last sleep. A healing coma will help him resist the armor's effects, but even though, it should overcome him in about a month. The parasite armor is designed to overtake its host, Vilith Dal said. However, it was designed for U.S. Hanvong life forms. There is no way your master would survive. It would kill him and the parasite both. He snorted and shook his head. We should have designed smarter biots, but our Shapers followed the orthodoxy laid down by the priests and Shimra for too long. It's not your fault, Dishon said sternly. And there must still be a way to save him. Every problem has a solution. Every disease has a cure. Vilith Dal snarled, baring sharp teeth. Many of my people would say disease is an affliction from the gods, from which there can be no appeal. A few of my people have whispered that Lord Crate has offended the Force somehow, Dishan said with equal disdain. Vilith Dal tilted his head. Do you disbelieve in the Force, Dishan? She shook her head. Oh no. I can feel it. Use it, though not as well as the Masters. I do not believe it has a will. I refuse to believe it controls our actions. We control our own. The true Sith doesn't whine about fate. She takes hold of what she wants and wrenches it from the stubborn claws of the universe. Vilith Dal chuckled. You would have made a fine Yuuzhan Vong shaper. No. Your fashion sense is beyond me. She gestured to his headdress. Still, this isn't the place for humor. We have to save Lord Crate and we're running out of time. I can't return to my ship, run further tests, he said, but that was a lie. He had no hint of anything else he could do for Crate, except kidnap Keela Quad and bring her here. He froze. He could do that. Zanima Seket's engines were down. It had no place to go. Master Quad herself was almost certainly secluded on the exact same remote mountain she'd locked herself away on years ago. What? Dishan asked. Do you have an idea? Perhaps. Vilith Dal demurred. It is too soon to say. She was obviously unsatisfied but knew when not to press. Do you want to return to your ship now? Please, he gave a slight bow. When they stepped out of the lab, they were met with their typical honor guard, a half-dozen Yuuzhan Vong warriors on one side of the hallway, and an equal number of black-robed, tattooed Sith on the other. Even Vilith Dal, who was more or less used to it by now, had to admit they made a truly terrifying combination. He was marched back to the cofferdam that connected to his shuttle. Darth Wyerlock was not there this time, so he got a farewell salute from the one with the two tall horns sticking out of his head. Then he entered the umbilical and went back to his ship, 6 warriors on his heels. He didn't speak to them once the whole way back to his flagship, Honor Regained. At some 3 kilometers long, Regained was the largest Yuuzhan Vong vessel recovered by the Sith scouts. They found her floating all the way on the outer rim, 7 parsecs outside the Belkanon system. It had taken great effort, and almost 100 implanted bites, to pump lifeblood into her systems. She had proven herself in combat several times already, though, and Vilith Dal was confident she would do so again when the time came. He hoped, however, that this would not be soon. After his shuttle linked to Regained, he boarded the vessel and was greeted by his first officer, Voron La. There were more than a few of the deceased War Master's domain here on Regained. It seemed they felt they had something to prove. Voron La himself was the picture of the fanatic amateur. At only 20 standard years old, he was tall and stringy, too young to have fought in the war, yet his face was a hideous mess of scars and tattoos, most of them inflicted in the past 6 months. Not one but 2 amphistaffs writhed around his waist. When he greeted Vilith Dal, he did not bow in deference to his elder, but said simply, "Welcome aboard," with the condescension all too common among the warrior caste too young to have seen actual war. "Thank you for receiving me," Vilith Dal said, with equal lack of enthusiasm. "Please, take me to Mal La. I have something important to discuss with him." "The War Master is on the bridge," Voron La said. "He is attending to critical." "Nothing is more critical than this," Vilith Dal snapped. For a second, Voron La looked frightened, but then he put on a sneered mask. "If you truly insist, I can speak with him. But if he declines..." "Do it," Vilith Dal said. Voron La stared at the Shaper for just long enough that he didn't appear weak in front of his subordinates. Then he took 5 steps down the hall, stroked the Vilip on his shoulder to life, and spoke with it in muffled tones. Vilith Dal waited patiently and did not strain to hear. He trusted in the conversation's outcome. Unlike his lieutenant, Mal La was not a fool. When the conversation was over, Voron La walked back and, trying to hide his chagrin, said, "The War Master will see you in his command parlor." "Very good." Vilith Dal nodded and started down the hall. His 6 soldiers followed behind him, leaving Voron La to watch their backs in consternation. When he arrived at the command parlor, he found Mal La standing before the gem-like lens of the viewport, watching stars and warships drift past slowly outside. The self-proclaimed War Master, a distant relative of Saving La himself, was tall and broad-shouldered, though his face lacked the ritual scarring of so many of his caste. Instead, a myriad of red and blue tattoos writhed across his gray skin, climbing his bare arms, slipping under the black cloak he wore over his shoulders, and slipping up his neck and across his cheeks and forehead. "Belek to you, Eminence," Vilith Dal said, snapping his wrists against his shoulders. "Welcome back." Maul turned around and took a step toward the Shaper. He moved with a slight hobble. He had once lost a leg fighting the enemy at Elysia, and the replacement had never grafted quite right. During the war, Savin La had lost a leg and nearly been killed by a corrupt replacement, put on by one of Vilith Dal's own domain. Maul, however, was not one to hold to blood feuds. He had welcomed Vilith Dal into true honor, as well he should have, because a fleet full of warrior caste thugs needed every good Shaper they could get. "What have you to report?" Maul asked as he came within arm's length of the Shaper. Vilith Dal said, "Unfortunately, the situation with Darth Krayt is at an impasse. The Vonduan armor threatens to consume his body. He will probably slip into a coma within a week and die thereafter." Maul scowled. "And what comes of our alliance then?" "Oh, I think we could slaughter the Sith if we had to, but it would be costly. Say 20 of ours for every Dark Lord." "Is that a joke?" "No, it is not," Vilith Dal said gravely. "However, I do have another idea. It is rather unorthodox, but if you agree to it, we must move quickly." Maul regarded him carefully. "Just say what you wish, Shaper." "I propose a return to Zanima Second." Maul's eyes went wide. "For what purpose?" "Healing Krayt is beyond my abilities," Vilith Dal admitted. "However, I'm convinced my master could do it." Kilaquad. The old witch has been hiding in the mountains for years. Likely she has gone mad. Even mad, she is the most brilliant member of our race alive. If she can't save Krayt, it cannot be done. "And how do you propose we get her?" "Fly into Zanima's orbit and ask politely." "It will require a raid," Vilith Dal admitted. "I know where to find her, so I can lead. I suggest we send a wounded ship, begging to surrender, as a feint. They are fools, but they are not stupid. They will never accept it. They don't have to accept. They only have to hesitate long enough for us to get into orbit." Vilith Dal let his eyes drift over Maul's shoulder to the drifting stars and warships. "What of the beacon?" "The beacon still transmits, best we can tell," Maul said. "We have not dislodged the enemy missile from its place inside Heart of Flame. Yet they have not attacked. They would be fools too. Our combined fleet outnumbers theirs." This was true, though most of the vessels recovered and resurrected with biotes were undermanned, and their crew disproportionately made up of inexperienced young fanatics like Voronla. Moreover, they lacked any of the Yamsk War coordinators that had been vital to battles of the last war. Vilith Dal did not know what kind of crew the renegade fleet possessed, but he would bet most of them were actual veterans of the war, not angry youths. "Perhaps," he said, "we should send Heart of Flame as our damaged ship." Maul's face showed surprise, then consideration. He said, "We do not know what would happen if the renegades attack Zanima Second. The world may yet cling to dreams of peace and refuse to defend itself." "And what if it does not?" Maul scowled. Like many in true honor, he clung to the belief that their military victories would draw more of their people away from Zanima Second and out into the galaxy to make war once again. That was one reason that they had not attacked the living world thus far. There was also a strong reluctance on the part of many US Hanvong to harm their own kind, even the naive ones who sided with horror. Finally, they knew Sekhet was perfectly capable of defeating a whole fleet if it summoned the willpower. "All right," the Shaper shrugged. "If it needs help, we can bring our fleet in and smash the enemies. We will become saviors of the entire US Hanvong race, and they will all flock to join us and take war to the stars again. Is that to your liking?" "It is," Maul admitted. "But such a feat would carry certain risks." Vilith Dal bore his teeth in another imitation of a humanoid smile. Come, War Master. Surely you know that without risk, there can be no reward. Chapter 10. The second shuttle banked over the vanes of the planet's hyperdrive engines. 3 massive durasteel shafts, round and pointed at the tip, rose hundreds of meters in the air. They emerged from deep chasms of machinery that burrowed deep into the planet itself. The engines were a surreal sight, not just for their scale, but for the way they emerged from nothing. There were no cities, no towns for miles in any direction, only low rolling hills covered in high grass. The man who had once been Barden Jusik, and now called himself Gadab, stared out the shuttle's porthole in awe. Just when he thought this strange world couldn't surprise him anymore, it went and did it. "We're coming in for landing," the pilot, a blue-skinned pharaoh, reported. "Copy that," said Jaina Solo. The slim, dark-haired Jedi was seated in the co-pilot's seat, and she turned around to look at the people seated along the benches in the cargo hold. "Everyone okay back there?" "Bright and shiny, goddess," said the white-haired man closest to the cockpit. He was on the far side of middle age, but he still had youthful eyes and a teasing smile. Next to him was a red-skinned Deveronian, and incongruously, a shaggy Wookiee female. Jaina just rolled her eyes, shifted her position, and looked at the people on the other bench. "Are we good?" "Good as we'll ever be," Mariel Scarata said. Like Gadab, the old clone was entranced by the approaching hyperdrive vanes. Gadab still wasn't sure why Jaina Solo had insisted they all come with her. To keep an eye on them, most likely. Gadab had lived as long as he had by not being trusting, so he didn't hold it against her. Muriel had been an expert slicer in his youth, and he was still good at cryptography, but he knew nothing about fixing engines, normal or supersized. Gendry was a pilot and might know something. Bess was more of a run-and-gun type, not a tinkerer. And then there was Venku, Katika, sitting stiffly on the bench, looking straight ahead through the forward cockpit viewport. He'd regained basic locomotion since arriving on Zana Maseket, but his movements were stiff. He did not speak much, like he was lost in his own thoughts. As for Gadab, his Mandalorian name might have meant engineer, but he had no idea how to fix a set of hyperdrive engines like this. From the air they looked like typical engines on an immense scale, but he knew the technology required to move an entire planet past lightspeed must be astoundingly complex. In the end, he found he didn't mind coming along for the ride. He wanted to see more of this world. In small, good ways, it reminded him of Mandalore. It had broad open spaces, mountains, forests, lakes. Even its town and city seemed humble, unspoiled by the pretensions of civilization. It was less industrialized than Mandalore, but as he'd gotten older, Gadab had cared less for machines and more for unspoiled nature. The shuttle circled around the landing site located between the 3 massive vanes. When it finally settled in his berth, the hatch on the roof of the cargo hold opened and a pair of pharaohs lowered a ladder for them to climb out of. Gadab would have greatly preferred a landing ramp, but apparently Sekhet liked to tax the strength of old men. Gadab wasn't that broke down, so he pulled himself up rung upon rung until he stood on the sleek green hood of the shuttle. Sleek silver vanes rose to dizzying heights on either side, and he craned his neck back to get a good view of the 3 massive constructions stabbing toward a slightly overcast sky. "Incredible," the white-haired man said as he came out of the hatch. "Hey goddess, how long ago were these things built?" "Sometime during the Old Republic," Jaina's muffled voice came from the hold. The big Wookiee popped out of the hold next, followed by Solo herself. "Must be a pain to maintain," the human whistled. "Probably a magnet for lightning strikes, high wind gusts." The Wookiee groaned something. "Yuhana's right, Shar," the Deveronian said. "They've got a really sleek, aerodynamic design. Still, there's got to be some heavy wind." Gadab turned his attention to his fellow Mandas. Per Jaina's request, they were allowed to wear their armor but no helmets, and their faces all looked small and naked as they squinted up at the hyperdrive vanes. "Well," Bess grunted, "now I've seen everything." Muriel nodded. Wind kicked the braids of his long gray hair, making them flail over his shoulders. "You can say that again?" Jaina Solo stood with her hands on her hips and looked around the group. Okay, here's the plan. Shar, Huhana, I want you to check with the work crews in the South Vein. Dricol, Mariel, best check with the command center by the West Vein. See how their diagnostics have been working. Gendry, Gadab, and Venku, check out the North Vein. And what are you up to? Shar asked. I'm doing a little bit of everything. Must be hard to be a goddess. Jaina sighed. It always is. Come on, all of you, get to work. They descended the stairs one by one and walked across the landing deck. The command station, Gadab saw, was a low durasteel bunker right next to the landing pad. As Muriel, Bess, and the younger human made a line for that, Gadab slowed his pace and sidled along Jaina Solo. How are you holding up? She asked him. Better than I thought I would. And Venku? The same? He's recovering better than Fi did from a similar injury. But that was a long time ago. Tell me, why does he call you goddess? Jaina sighed yet again. A long story. Back during the U.S. Hanvong War, Shar helped me run. Well, I guess you call it a PSYOPs program. We were trying to convince the U.S. Hanvong that I was their trickster goddess Yunharla. And why would the Vongese believe that? Because Yunharla had a twin brother. Twins are very rare among the U.S. Hanvong. They're considered sacred. She looked like she was going to say more, but snapped her mouth shut. I see, Gadab said simply, then changed tack. Do you really think we can help you? You already have engineering crews from the fleet here. I'm mostly interested in what you and Venku can do, she said plainly. Because we possess the Force. That's right. This is a piece of machinery. An extraordinary one, but still a machine. It's part of a living world, Jaina said. Living things and machinery aren't opposed here. They coexist in strange ways. I'm already aware of that. He sighed. All right. I will help with the inspection. That's all I ask, Jaina said. Then Gadab turned to follow Venku and Gendry toward the entrance to the north shaft, while Jaina headed to the command bunker. A platform attached to the rim of the massive shaft took them deeper into the planet's engine. There was no cover except a simple metal bar along the edge, and wind whirled around the vein and buffeted the walls of the shaft. It took all of Gadab and Venku's strength just to hold onto the railing. The further down they went, the thicker the smooth metal vein gradually became. The open space of the shaft grew narrower, and the overcast sky more distant, giving Gadab a feeling of claustrophobia. The idea that these engine shafts could fill with destructive thrust energy at any moment was more than a little disquieting. The engineering teams already working in the shaft did not seem to care much about the new arrivals. Gadab asked the chief some perfunctory questions about the machinery, and the chief gave distracted answers. Gendry paced the walkways rimming the shaft at regular intervals and observed the crew as they calibrated parts of the machinery. Venku stayed by the lift, staring up at the distant sky, apparently lost in his own thoughts. Gadab did learn some things about the engines. They were, in many ways, supersized versions of typical starship engines, but with key differences. They possessed elaborate shock absorbers so as not to tear the planetary crust apart every time they were fired. The power core, 3 miles deep beneath the planet's surface, was especially well armored. Every system contained layers upon layers of redundancy. Modifications had been made again and again over almost a century, patching together technology from the Old Republic, Galactic Alliance, Pharaohs, even some U.S. Hanvong. It was an engineer's joy and nightmare both. Most importantly, the chief said, they only worked when Sekhet wanted them to work. And that was what bothered Gadab about this, about Zanima Sekhet as a whole. The planet was a living being, with a consciousness that manifested itself within the Force. It was also a planet filled with artificial things, from cities to landing pads to giant hyperdrive engines. Somehow, they were all unified into one system, even if nobody living on said planet knew exactly how that system worked. Gadab had always been good at compartmentalization. It had made him a good engineer and a good doctor. It had also helped him switch from Jedi Knight to Mandalorian, swapping out one ancient order for another, even though so many of their values and rituals were diametrically opposed. When he used the Force, he used it like a tool, to heal or sometimes to harm. He knew some Jedi spoke like they were in touch with some unifying facet of the cosmos, but he'd only felt that elation once, a very long time ago, and only with the aid of another being vastly more powerful than himself. He'd almost entirely forgotten the sensation. When he was young, training under Arlegan Z, he'd never come close to that feeling. When Jedi got all mystical, it was usually prelude to some righteous campaign against the evil dark side wielding Sith that ended with billions dead. He was self-aware enough to know that the Mandas had their mystical, clannish side too. On one level, he'd been hypocritical to swap out Jedi for Mandalorian in a fit of moral pique regarding the Republic's treatment of clone soldiers. The Mandalorians could be brutal, especially to outsiders. In the end, what had made him turn Mando wasn't moral outrage. He needed a place to belong, a clan to call his own, and he hadn't gotten that from Z and the Jedi. He got that from Cal Skirata's Mando, loving clones, so he followed their path instead. It was as simple and amoral as that. As he watched the engineers work, he decided what, above all, fascinated the frightened him about Zanima Second. In this living world he found a refutation of the mechanical, compartmentalized life he'd built for himself. It spoke of lofty, mystic things, the kind maybe he could have known if only he hadn't turned his back on Jedi tradition in a burst of adolescent anger and reduced the Force to a simple tool for performing useful tricks. Jagged didn't feel sorry for himself. He made his choice a long time ago. What he wondered was whether his resentment toward the Jedi, his suspicion of the Force itself, had stolen something from Venku, something that was, from a certain point of view, his birthright. After an hour or so in the shaft, he felt he had nothing more to do or say, so he took the lift back up. Venku and Gendry stayed behind, watching the Alliance and Pharaoh Tech's work. The overcast clouds had faded and sun broke through a filmy layer to shine brightly on the surface of the planet. Jagged walked across the landing field to the edge and stared out across the fields. Tall grass rippled and shimmered across the low-rolling hills. There were no forests or mountains to break the view, no artificial things of any kind. The bright fields seemed to go on forever beneath a brilliant sky. "Nice, isn't it?" Jaina Solo said beside him. Jagged jerked and stared at her. He hadn't heard her sneak up behind him, hadn't been track of time as he watched the grass. He was getting soft in his old age, or possibly senile. "There's nothing for me down there," he said. "It's interesting, but the techs know what they're doing." Maybe, Jaina shrugged. According to the diagnostics they've been running, the engines still aren't drawing power from the main core. They've checked and double-checked all the equipment, so it should work. "It only works if the planet wants to." Jagged shook his head. "You've got a machine with a mind of its own." "Something like that," Jaina said. "Pretty frustrating, huh? This is why I gave up on all that cryptic mystic Jedi Isaac a long time ago," Jagged muttered. "Meaning what exactly?" "I'm an engineer, a doctor, a soldier. I like things that are reliable, predictable. The Force isn't like that. I know. That's why I don't like to use it." Jaina looked out at the grass. Wind blew at their backs, sending streamers of hair flying past her face. When it changed direction, she tucked strands behind her ears and said, "Ben met his mother today." Jagged stared for a moment, confused. Then he understood. Ben Skywalker, the Grand Master's son, and heir apparent. Ben Skywalker, whose mother had been murdered by Jaina Solo. "You mean he saw her ghost?" "That's right," Jaina nodded. "In the forest. Sekit appeared as a small boy and led him to her." "And what did she say?" "I don't know. Ben wouldn't tell. I figure it's between him and Mara." The idea of life after death was another of those mystic Force things Jagged didn't like to think about. It was complicated and disturbing on many levels, hopeful and sad at once. After Atane died during Order 66, Cal Skirata had asked him whether her spirit might survive in the Force. Jagged, or Barden as he still called himself then, had answered truthfully, yes, he believed part of Atane might survive. He'd been afraid Skirata might be offended by that, might see life to death as another privilege claimed by hated saber jockeys. But instead, Cowboy had looked relieved. Thankful, even. Gadab still hoped Etain might survive, in some fashion, after death. He knew Venku still craved to speak with her, to feel his mother's presence, though he'd never admit it aloud. A part of Gadab, deep down, hoped that he might survive too. Another part hated the very thought. His clan, his brothers and sisters and his adopted children and grandchildren, his late wife, they were not Jedi. Only Venku and his children had any Jedi genes. The rest of them would go to join the Mandaean when they died. But that was just a vague concept of continued Mando culture. Not true, Blue Ghost, life to death. He wanted to see Etain after he died, but also didn't want to exist without all those he'd known and loved. He felt torn, and when he was stuck on a problem with no solution, he normally tried his best to ignore it. Jaina watched him for a while, and when he didn't say anything, she continued. Ben says he could talk to Mara because she'd been on second before. Because it had met her, the planet was able to retrieve her from wherever she was. That's the way I understand it, at least. Gadab didn't know what he'd do if he faced Etain's blue ghost. Likely she wouldn't even recognize him. Death had trapped her forever as a young woman, small but brave enough to defy the Jedi Order for love of a man most of the galaxy didn't even consider human, while time had marched on 4 Barden Jusik and turned him into a scarred, gray, ugly old man who'd far outlived his time. Jaina hugged herself, shivered in the cold wind. I'm worried. I'm afraid I might see him. Ah, of course. Wrapped up in grief from a lifetime ago, Gadab hadn't even thought about Jaina and the brother she had killed. You can't know, can you? Gadab said. That's the problem with the damned Force. It just does what it wants. Yeah, Jaina choked. Pretty much. Things are usually simpler without it, he said. Water gleamed in her eyes. Gadab turned his gaze to the grass, still rippling and shining in the wind. Jaina didn't say anything for a long time, and neither did he. He felt very powerless here, and very small. After a while, Jaina asked, Did you love her? Venku's mother, I mean. Gadab looked at her, surprised. Of course she'd consider his pain. She was the selfless Jedi, not him. I did, he admitted. Not romantically. I don't think so anyway. I was a kid, and I wouldn't have understood romantic love even without the Jedi brainwashing. But like a sister, maybe. And Venku's father, did you love him? Darman was a brother to me. If you met Darman again, what would you say to him? I've never thought about that, Gadab grunted truthfully. Etain he'd thought about, but Darman no. That life, his agony and failure and tragic ending, was one of those things he'd compartmentalized. Unlike with Etain, the Force couldn't dangle any taunting lure in front of him. Darman was gone forever, and there was no point in looking back. Still, he felt he had to ask. Have you thought about what you say your brother? No, Jaina said firmly, forbidding discussion. Gadab knew she was telling the truth. Even a Jedi learned to compartmentalize if she had to. For a moment, as she looked at the U.S. Henvong attendant standing before her in her personal Demudak, Magister Danny Kui felt a surge of her old revulsion for his race. Just quickly as it came, it was gone, but it still startled her. The sudden intrusion of Jaina Solo and Tahiri Veila into her life again, and the awful revelation of Jasmine's final fate, had shaken her deeply and brought long-buried emotions to the fore. But once it was gone, she assessed the being in front of her. Very O'Shea was a far cry from the grotesque Preterite Vong warriors who'd held her captive on Helska 4 all those years ago, her first introduction to their face. He'd been a young soldier when the leader of Domain Shay had died in disgrace at Aether, and he spent most of the ensuing war at the rear lines, far from chances of glory, left to consort with the battered worker caste who made up the bulk of U.S. Henvong society. The experience had opened his mind. Once the war ended, he'd thrown himself into the recreation of U.S. Henvong society on Zanima II and become one of Danny's most trusted adjutants. The self-inflicted scars of his youth were buried now, barely visible beneath his white face paint. Very O'Shea bent his head forward slightly, inquisitive. Is something troubling you, Magister? I'm all right, she shook her head. She was sitting on an organic chair sack, looking up at the intendant as he stood before her in a respectful pose. She took a breath and said, I just want to reiterate how important this mission is, and how important it is that we bring back Keela Quad. She might be the only one who can convince the hyperdrives to work. Do you think Rena Quad will be able to convince her? He sounded skeptical. I can't say for sure, she admitted, but we have to try. Very O'Shea thought a moment, then asked if Keela Quad refuses to come with us, should we take her by force? Wordlessly, Danny nodded. I shall bring some warriors, then. She shook her head. We don't want to scare her. You know some Extol who would be good in a fight, don't you? Very O'Shea nodded. He'd long ago shed his caste prejudice. Good. Take them? I'm sure Rena Quad can also help if you need it. She is small but quite durable. When Danny had last seen Tahiri, the woman hadn't seemed durable at all. The telling of all Jason's crimes had racked her almost as much as it had Danny, and the sudden appearance of Sekit, as Tahiri's teenage self of all things, seemed to have hurt her in a place she hadn't dared bear to Danny and her. It was why Danny was giving instructions to Very O'Shea now instead of the Jedi woman. It was far easier emotionally. Not for the first time, it made Danny wonder if Sekit had developed a cruel streak. She forced a smile and said, Good hunting, Very O'Shea. He snapped his arms in a cross over his chest, wrists to shoulders, and bowed slightly. We won't fail you, Magister. She watched him go. To her surprise, that smile lingered on her face. It had been a long, long road from Helska 4 to Zanima Sekit, and when she dwelled on it, she found it hard to believe. The first human to encounter the U.S. Hanvong invasion force and survive was now their leader. Such an impossibility was enough to give her hope, and hope was what she needed right now. Shortly after Very O'Shea left, Horror ducked his head beneath the threshold and stepped into her demudek, trailing white robes behind him. The sight of the old priest also gave her hope, it always had. Without Horror's help, she could have never managed to reform U.S. Hanvong society as much as she had. He'd been particularly helpful in disassembling a hierarchy of fanatic priests who clung to the old bloodletting ways under the guidance of former High Priest Jagged. Danny was not by nature a spiteful person, but when the old bastard had died 6 years after the war's end, she'd been glad of it. They'll be off soon, she told Horror as the old priest folded his bony legs beneath him and sat on the chair sack opposite hers. I know, he said, placing his hands on his kneecaps as they jutted out beneath his robes. I just spoke with Rena Quad. How is she holding up? Danny asked. She is trying to put her mind on the future. Horror examined her face. Are you, Danny Quee? Danny laughed, a dry, sad, incredulous laugh. She shook her head and said, How can I? Ken is not the issue. You must do it, for all our sakes. If these true victory people find us, then? I know. She blew a little sigh and looked the priest in the eye. Doesn't it matter to you, though, what happened to Jason? Of course it matters. But it was a long time ago. We have to look to our story now, Danny Quee. Is this finished? It's an awful way for a story to end. Jason was special, important. Without him, we would not have liberated my people from the bondage they kept themselves in. I know. But it's more than that, Horror. Jason, he had a destiny. Everyone knew it. She and the priest had had their share of theological discussions over the years. They'd long since reconciled Danny's belief in the Force guiding beings to Horror's idea of the gods controlling fates. Perhaps his destiny was to defeat Onami and guide our people to Zanima. Horror spread his long-fingered hands. If so, he accomplished what his Force meant for him to do. But what happened after that? I still don't understand how the Jason we knew, the who had that destiny, saved your people, could become what Tahiri said he did. She looked at her lap and couldn't bring herself to say any more. From the moment she'd met Jason on Helska 4, she'd known the boy was special. Over the war's 5 years, she'd watched him grow from a troubled boy to a confident, strong man who had a connection with the Force that no other being did, not even Master Skywalker. A part of her had come to love the man he'd become. She didn't know exactly when it happened, maybe when they were on the mission to find Zanima Second together, but probably before that, when he'd returned from the dead and they spent lazy days together on Mon Calamari's endless oceans. By then, the boy had definitely become a man. Those memories had given her bittersweet nostalgia, even after Sekhet had told her of Jacyn's death. Now that she knew the truth of it all, it was painful just to conjure his image in her head. Jedi can be redeemed, she said. Darth Vader was, Kype Durran, and others. But Jacyn, it just seemed so unfair that after everything Jacyn was, he'd die a monster. But after everything he did, I don't know how he could be redeemed. She stared at her lap for a long time, at her clenched pale hands, before Horror said, Danny Kui, do you know how many beings I killed? Her head snapped up. The old priest was looking at her calmly. He said, I don't. I sacrificed many thousands from your galaxy to the gods, because I believed all the bloodthirsty dogma that had been passed down by our people for generations. But that's different, Danny said. They'd never out and out talked about this before, not in all their years on Zanima together, and she couldn't believe has bringing it up now. What you did, you were taught to do. It was part of the culture, passed down for generations. He shook his head. Culture is no excuse. Otherwise, why try to reform it as we have? Danny Kui, I sacrificed too many to the gods. I did it out of piety, not malice. I remember once talking theology with the H-Kick priest before sending him off to the immolation pits. When you look at me, Danny Kui, do you see that priest's face, and the faces of all those thousands I killed for Unyamka? You know I don't. Why? His tone was blunt, almost cruel. It was a simple but biting question. Just allowing the U.S. Henvong to retreat to Zanima Second had been an act of amnesty. Horror was hardly the only one on this world who'd killed innocents in the war. The only way for this new society of theirs to function was to look past old crimes and concentrate on the future. Which was, she supposed, what the old priest was trying to tell her. You've earned his forgiveness, she sniffed, through everything you've done for me. For your people. I'm glad to know that. He sounded genuinely relieved. But Jacyn didn't get that chance. Jaina had killed him before that. Danny didn't know if she'd be able to look the woman in the eye the next time they met, knowing what she did now. But it is possible, Horror said, that given the time, the opportunity, the second chance. There are no second chances. He's dead. That's the whole point. Her voice shook. Horror lowered his eyes. I am sorry. I did not mean to upset you. Oh, I know. She got up, knelt down in front of him, and placed her palms on his long bony fingers. I appreciate everything you've done for me, Horror, all this time. I couldn't have held his planet together without you. He met her eyes again. Then you should be cheered, Danny Kui. You friends have returned. I know. She squeezed his hands. And believe me, I am. Yet Jacyn's loss, his corruption and death, had left a hole that not even Jaina and Tahiri's return could fill. She didn't know how those women had lived with that awful knowledge for the past 4 years. Despite all the trials she herself had been through, she found she didn't envy them at all. In the end, Tahiri led a party of 6 to find Kila Quad. Horror allowed them to take a second ship from the town, though he warned her not to get too close to Quad's supposed hiding place in the Blue Mountains. That Master Shaper had, unsurprisingly, set traps to ensure her privacy against intruders from the air. When Tahiri asked if intruders from the ground would fare any better, the old priest had just shrugged. Unlike the second vessel she had recovered from the broken True Honor frigate, the mechanical components of this ship had not been removed and replaced with Davin basals and U.S. Henvong bioformed interface masks. Instead, they retained sleek metallic consoles, holographic projectors, and other amenities familiar to pilots all over the galaxy. Tahiri and Scott took the helm, but to her surprise the other U.S. Henvong in the party showed no aversion to the mechanical devices. 2 of them were extolled, and that might have had something to do with it. The former members of the Shamed Ones under caste had been quicker than the other to eschew the stricter tenets of traditional U.S. Vong theology. She did not know Vletham or Nerith, but apparently the two of them spent much time exploring the Blue Mountain on foot. Both were tall and wiry of build. Nerith had been shamed because his body would not take to implants, leaving his appearance nearly as smooth and natural-looking as Scott's. Vletham, by contrast, had a hideous, crab-like claw grafted onto one shoulder, the result of a shaping gone wrong. Massive canines protruded from his jaw, giving him a fearsome appearance, though his eyes were tired and sad. Also with the group was the intendant Vari O'Shea and a female shaper named Kadra Val. Tahiri had worked with both of them in growing new villages in which the new U.S. Vong population would live, and Kadra Val had cooperated with Keela Quad on several projects. She distinctly remembered Kadra Val's disgust at mechanical technology, but that was 15 years ago, and she seemed to have grown used to it since then. The same seemed true for the U.S. Vong in general. As they flew through Zanima's lower atmosphere toward the mist-shrouded mountain range, the other U.S. Vong had many questions for Scott. Vletham asked him what it was like growing up amidst humans, and whether he had faced hatred from them. Kadra Val asked about the Neoglyph masker technology he developed, while Nerith asked whether he followed any of the traditional religion. Scott wasn't big on the old gods, but Nerith had a lot to say. He was a follower of a new god in the pantheon, the Ganner, who was popular with the warriors but also with some extolled. Vletham, meanwhile, was a follower of the prophet Yusha, the great leader who gave hope to the Shamed Ones and, he claimed, had been martyred during the retaking of U.S. Hunter. It was a strange conversation for Tahiri to listen to. When she left Zanima II, the cults to both Ganner Rissold and Yusha had been slowly growing. The Ganner she had known had been a brave Jedi, but also vain, and something of a braggart. Still, she knew he had died heroically, fighting bravely against thousands of warriors, using Anakin's lightsaber no less, so she didn't begrudge him his posthumous honor. The worship of Yusha was more difficult, because Tahiri was one of the few beings on Zanima II who knew that the prophet who had led the Shamed Ones' insurrection against Shimra was actually Nam Ander, the scheming executor who had murdered Nin Yim and nearly killed Sekhet itself. Nam Ander had, in fact, died at the end of the war, but Tahiri had to admit that, for his scheming selfish reasons, he had helped bring down a corrupt and bloodthirsty regime, setting the U.S. Vong on course for redemption. She was uncomfortable with the idea that a man she despised might have left a positive mark on the galaxy. Scud himself was busy trying to pilot this new ship, and he acted annoyed at the questioning. At the same time, Tahiri knew that a part of him was thrilled with the attention. She could feel it through her Vong sense. It was strange, operating on two layers of yourself. With one part of her, the part she called Tahiri, the part she'd acted as for the last decade, she could feel the forest-draped mountains beneath her hum with the Force. She could feel the life in this ship too. The other part of her, the Rena who'd lay dormant and sometimes almost forgotten since leaving Zanima II, she could sense the telepathic energy of these beings. It was not the Force exactly. She could not pick up Vletham with her mind like she could the trees or bushes they were passing. She could, however, sense some of their emotions, their energy. Jason had described her Vong sense, his Vong sense, too, as being like the telepathic powers of a Yamsk war coordinator. Tahiri had not liked being compared to a Yamsk, and did not particularly like it now, but it was the best comparison she could muster. Yes, Vletham was saying, but how often do you wear your masker? All of the time? Some of it. Some of it, Scott said, keeping his eyes on the approaching mountains. Most of it, I guess. When you are in public, walking through the crowd, do you wear your masker? I do, he admitted. Always. Pretty much, yes. Vletham shook his ugly head, like he was disappointed. Do you always feel the need to hide what you are? Not always. My squad mates, my comrades, are used to me like this, Scott said defensively. And a U.S. Vong is not all I am. Then are you a hybrid like Rena Quad? Kadra Val asked, tentacles writhing on her head. Scott blinked, momentarily confused. Then he realized who Rena was. No, I'm not like her. I'm not a hybrid. But my father is human. My comrades are human, Claudite, Wookiee, Gamorrean. Gamorrean. Kodra Val hissed. They are barely sentient. He's not an ordinary Gamorrean, just like I'm not ordinary US Hinvong, Scut insisted. In fact, hush, Tahiri whistled. We're getting close. Vletham Nerith, give me some help here. She slowed her ship's engines and felt the two extol lean in over her shoulder. Nerith stuck a smooth gray hand out and pointed to the largest mountain in view. That one? She asked. No, Nerith said. Do you see the smaller peak, rising from its southern foothill? I see it. Is that hers? Nerith nodded. She likely has traps for those who come by air. You shall have to land in the valley to the south and walk. We're walking, Tahiri said. All 6 of us, remember. You're here to show us those traps. Nerith nodded. As you say, Rena Quad. Tahiri didn't object to that name. Here, surrounded by US Hinvong, it was as good a name as any. She set the shuttle down in the valley. It took them 15 minutes to pack their things and begin the long walk up the mountain. Tahiri and Scut were dressed in patterned camouflage jumpsuits and carried heavy packs on their backs, but the other US Hinvong wore only animal hide tunics and carried no cargo. An amphistaff unwound from Kodra Val's arm and turned into a walking stick. Another appeared in Varioshe's hand. Vletham bent forward and used his deformed, claw-like hand to help him with the ascent. Then didn't talk much on the way up. The vegetation of the slope was a mix of boras, waist-high scrub, and blades of tall grass. The ground was left damp by the blue-tinted mist that gave the mountains their name, and Tahiri had to step carefully to keep from slipping. The air was chill, and she barely sweat through her jumpsuit. Second, as a whole, felt significantly cooler than she remembered. Danny had explained that, after the emergency jump, Second's normally hot, humid atmosphere had become drier and chillier. It had damaged the growth of the younger boras and affected some of the natural fauna in the forest, but thankfully had not destroyed the ecosystem entirely. Maybe that was something Keela Quad could help with. Maybe Second itself would get around to fixing things, once it stopped communing with the dead, or whatever its deal was. She was used to the living world being cryptic and shy. In her 5 years living on the planet, she'd only spoken to it less than a dozen times, during most of which it had been wearing Nin Yim's face. Those visions had always been forced projections. Whatever Second was doing now seemed to be assembling atoms and molecules with the Force and making visible to Force users and US Hinvong alike, and the possibilities that were both terrifying and fascinating. But Second was Second, and there was nothing she could do about it. She just wanted to get to Keela Quad and see if she could bring the reclusive shaper off her mountain. After about an hour's walk uphill, Nerith stopped the march and insisted they take a detour. He did not explain his reasons, but Tahiri saw no point in distrusting him. They circled around the waist of the mountain for another half hour, then began their ascent against. As they climbed higher up the mountain, the mist grew thinner. She could see further up tangled forest that rode the slope. The air grew chiller, though the physical effort of climbing the mountain was enough to keep her warm. After another half hour, Vletham ordered them to halt. Do we have to go around again? Asked Scut. Vletham shook his head. No, but I sense something coming. As if on cue, they heard something snapping through the forest ahead. Tahiri put a hand on her lightsaber but did not ignite, not yet. Whatever it was grew closer. The sounds of tumbling brush were replaced by the cracking of branches and the creaking of tree trunks. She flipped her lightsaber on just in time to see a dark lanky shape appear in the branches overhead. A black, furry animal hung between 2 trees, with 4 vice-like clawed feet and a prehensile tail clinging to different branches. The creature stared at them but did not attack. What is it? Scut whispered. One of her scouts, Kodra Val said. Like on the Alkayeth from US Inter, but different. Tahiri reached out with her Vong sense to touch the creature's mind. She felt predatory hunger, yes, but also curiosity, and dim flickerings of sentience. This was not a stupid beast, hungry to tear flesh from their bones. She tried to broadcast feelings into his mind. She projected calm, trust. The creature blinked at Big Eyes, then turned around and scampered from branch to branch, back up to the place from which it came. "What did you do?" Scott asked her. "I told it to play nice," Tahiri said. "The Force." Kadra Val shook her head. "Impossible." "Not the Force. I was able to touch its mind." "Fascinating," Vletham said. "Can you also?" "Enough talk," Variel Shea said sternly. "We don't have a lot of time before sunset. Let's get going." "Agreed," said Tahiri, and they resumed their climb. They received no more animal guests the rest of the trip. The scouts detected no more traps. They simply kept climbing until they found it, one lonely dome-shaped Demudak, located in a small clearing jutting out of the slope. Through the trees, Tahiri could see the ridges and peaks of the other mountains in the range, half dissolved in blue mist. "Come out, Keela Quad," she shouted in Yuuzhan Vong. "It is I, Rena Quad. Answer one of your own domain, Master Shaper." She waited, but nothing emerged from the Demudak. She plucked the lightsaber off her belt and moved forward cautiously. Variel Shay's and Nareth's amphistaff snapped to combat-ready mode, their snake-like mouths facing forward, and followed Tahiri's lead while the others spread out to the clearing's edge. Tahiri reached out with her Vong sense, trying to locate a sentient being within the Demudak. She found nothing. She held her breath as she went through the threshold. The inside of the Demudak was clearly being used. Fruit dangled from vines stretched beneath the ceiling. Shelves were full of Shaper's casses and other tools. A murky stew cooled at the bottom of a pot suspended over burnt twigs. "Rena Quad," Kadra Val shouted from outside. Tahiri ignited her lightsaber and dashed out of the Demudak, Variel Shay and Nareth right behind her. Vletham, Scut, and Kadra Val stood in a loose semicircle around the hunched, cloaked figure at the edge of the clearing. "Keela Quad," Tahiri called, still in Yuuzhan Vong. "It's you, isn't it?" The figure reached up. Gnarled hands with long, bony fingers pulled back the cloak's hood, revealing thin face, unscarred but etched with many inky black tattoos, topped by a Shaper's headdress of wilted tentacles. Age and isolation had not been kind of Keela Quad. Indeed, she now bore a startling resemblance to her domain sister, Mizhen Quad. Tahiri fought down revulsion and took 2 steps closer, holding her lightsaber in front of her. Keela Quad blinked red gold eyes and said, "What do you want, Heretic Spawn? Don't you want to know how I got here?" Tahiri asked. "I haven't seen you in over a decade. Zana Maseket was lost among the stars, cut off from the Jedi and the Alliance. Yet here I am and you're not the least surprised." "I am surprised, but so what?" Keela Quad shrugged. "I am an old woman. I want no part of your wars. Vilith Dao came to me, seeking my aid in some mad quest of his. I told him the same thing I tell you now, leave me alone." Danny had assured Tahiri that Vilith Dao had been tracked, and that he hadn't spoken to Keela Quad, but Tahiri trusted the Twisted Shaper more. She and Vilith Dao both probably had bags of tricks shoulder deep. "Master Quad," Kadra Val spoke up, "your people need you. Will you not serve them?" Keela Quad snorted. That is what Vilith Dao said too. Scut, who had been looking back and forth confused while the others spoke Yuuzhan Vong, called to Tahiri. "Tell her the enemy is coming. Tell her they have Alpha Red." The other Yuuzhan Vong knew basic, but none of them knew what Alpha Red was except for Keela Quad herself. The scientist glanced at Scut for the first time and took in his Alliance jumpsuit and scarless face. "What are you?" she said in halting basic. It must have been years since she had attempted that tongue. "My name is Vil Gorset, but you can call me Scut," he said with dignity. "You cannot speak our tongue," Keela Quad snapped. "You are not from Zana Maseket. I was raised by humans. I'm a member of Galactic Alliance Intelligence." "Incredible." Keela Quad spat. Tahiri couldn't tell if she was shocked, disgusted, or intrigued. "I do not speak our language well," Scut said, "but I know about our people." "They're not your people, infidel. You are a human in a Yuuzhan Vong massacre. Scott shook his head. No, but I've been a U.S. Hanvong and human masker plenty of times. It helps to blend in, given the work I do. She eyed him suspiciously, but Tahiri could sense the scientist's curiosity whirring inside her. Kilaqua said, "Where did you acquire a masker?" "I bred it," Scott said proudly. "I did not have any U.S. Hanvong life to breed, but I developed it using other alien life. It operates just like a masker, but without the pain required to take it on and off." "Pathetic," Kilaqua said. "You are soft as a human at heart." "I am what I am," Scott shrugged. "A little human, a little U.S. Hanvong, but mostly I am a shaper." Oh, Tahiri thought he was playing his cards well. "You are not a shaper." Kilaqua's head wagged from one direction to another. "I am a shaper. She, Kodra Val, is a shaper. You are a human playing with toys." "I came to learn from the best," Scott said. Kilaqua's jaw dropped open. It worked up and down but wouldn't close. Finally, she said, "You are a strange creature." "Probably," Scott said. "How about a deal? I tell you about all my experiments, and you help us with what we want." "You think your knowledge can add to mine in any way?" "I've been working in a completely different environment than you. It's likely I've learned some things you haven't. In the end, there's only one way to find out." Scowling, Kilaqua looked to Tahiri. "Why did you come here, Heretic Spawn? What is it you want from me?" "We want you to help repair Sekka's hyperdrive engines. We have technicians working on them now, but the organic aspect is beyond them. There are other shapers." Kilaqua glanced at Kadra Val. "Have you not examined it already?" "I have, Master," Kadra Val said. "But my knowledge is small. Yours is far greater." Kilaqua wagged her head back and forth again. "You flatter me, you all do. You peck at me like birds. You pry at me, you." "I am offering you all I know," Scud pressed. "Don't you want to learn something new after all this time?" Yes, he knew exactly what cards to play. Kilaqua's wondering gaze fixed on Scud. Reluctantly, she nodded. "Very well. Tell me everything you know, Vilgorset." "Fine," Scud said. "Just come with us back to the ship." "No." Kilaqua stamped her feet on the ground. "Tell me what you can, and I will judge the reward you deserve." Tahiri sighed loudly. "Master Shaper, we do not have the time to." "Don't dare instruct me, Heretic Spawn," Kilaqua shouted. "You are nothing but Mezhenqua's mistake. Don't pretend you are anything else." "It is all right," Scott said. "Let's sit down and talk." Tahiri shot him a glance. "Are you sure about this?" "No," he said, "but it's the best chance we have of getting what we came for, isn't it? Besides, I would like to pick her mind about a number of things." He looked at the old shaper and favored her with a smile. Kilaqua flinched but did not rebuke him. She gestured to the Demudek. "Come, let us sit and talk. If you wish, you can prepare food for the night." Over the next few hours, the sun went down over the misty blue mountains, and the temperature dropped. The silver gleam of Zanima Seket's planet filled the sky, forestalling true night. Kilaqua, Scud, and Kodra Val sat inside the Demudek for hours, talking shaper talk that Tahiri could only vaguely understand. Beneath the silver planet light, Tahiri opened up her and Scud's backpacks and began taking out the bedrolls. They had only brought one each, but the other U.S. Hanvong seemed unfazed by the prospect of sleeping on the grass in the cold mountaintop, far away from anything that passed for civilization. Nerith and Vletham simply sat down on the grass and hunched their bodies in on themselves. O'Shea seemed more affected by the night's chill than the extolled, and he pulled his short cloak tight around his body. "They will talk in here forever," he muttered. "Let them talk," Tahiri said in U.S. Hanvong. "We should have taken her back down the mountain, by force if we had to. That wouldn't have secured her cooperation, would it?" The intendant shook his head. "She is stringing him along, picking at him for information. She will not give us anything in return." "I'm not so sure of that," Tahiri said. With her Vong sense, she could feel genuine excitement from all three parties inside the Demudek. After years in the wilderness, Keela Quad was bitter, broken down, and probably half mad, but she still had a scientist's mind. Tahiri suspected that, deep down, she wanted to help salvage the hyperdrives. She just needed a reason to come off her mountain. A few hours after sundown, when the planet formed a broad silver bow in the southern sky, Scud came out of the Demu deck. Nerith and Vletham were both hunched in the grass, apparently sleeping, while Tahiri had allowed Varioshe to use her bedroll while she kept watch. Scud stepped out onto the grass and stared at the half-night sky. Breath escaped from his open mouth in puffs of vapor. Tahiri sidled beside him and said, "Anything good happened so far?" "I think so," he said. "We've talked a little about my Neoglyph maskers, and about the hyperdrive too. Mostly we've talked about other things." She explained all 8 courtesies of Shaper knowledge, in far more detail than any of the resources in the Alliance give. And about the creatures she's been breeding, like the one we saw in the forest. "Okay," Tahiri said. She didn't need Vong's sense to tell how excited Scud was, but he needed to stay on track. "Do you think she'll be ready to come down with us at dawn?" "I think," he said confidently. "She's still irascible. Likely to bite our heads off if we press too hard, and I don't mean figuratively. But still, we've got her excited. She hasn't talked about shaping with anyone in years." "Good." Tahiri crossed her arms over her chest. "Because getting her off this mountain is what we came for. Everything else is secondary, do you understand? That includes your scientific curiosity." Of course, Scud nodded. "Still, once this is all over, I think I need to spend more time on this world." "Yeah," Tahiri said softly. "Me too." He turned to look at her. I thought you'd have Jedi duties." "I'm not exactly a Jedi," she admitted. "Then what are you?" That was the billion-credit question, the one she'd been fumbling with half her life. Jedi, Sith, Yuuzhan Vong, Bounty Hunter, Tusken, Tahiri, Rena. All of those names and titles seemed like ephemeral labels slapped onto her, whatever ever-shifting thing she was. Kind of like Jaina Solo, she thought with a chill. "It doesn't matter what I am," she said softly, staring at the silver gas giant's faded arc. "What matters is where I am, what I'm doing, who I'm doing it with. And I think I'd like to spend more time on Zana Maseket." "Okay," said Scud. "So once we fix the hyperdrives, defeat Dala, get rid of Alpha Red, and save the Alliance from the True Honor fleet, we can take time off and commune with nature." "Sounds like a plan. I'm sure we'll have no problems with any of that." Tahiri sighed. "Are you always this sarcastic?" "It's important to be realistic," he said more seriously. "It's how we stay alive." To that, Tahiri had to agree. Jagged Phil sat behind the desk of his ready room, looking at the report on the communications array. Syal Antilles, seated across from him, had just given him a verbal rundown of the findings, but he skimmed through the technical details anyway. He was not an expert in communications technology, but he always wanted to be thorough. "Working at our current pace, I'm hoping to have the long-range transceiver back online within 7 hours, Syal was saying. All the other battle damage has been repaired, so we're essentially back to full fighting status." Jagged frowned. Why did we have to go EV to find damage on the comm? Shouldn't our onboard diagnostics have picked up this error? Syal shook her head. "There's a good chance there's an error in the communications firmware. When the transceiver was damaged, the console thought it kicked to backup systems, but that transceiver doesn't have backup systems. So the computer was, what? Running subroutines through systems that didn't exist." "Something like that, sir." Jagged groaned and placed the datapad on his desk. "Well, that is lovely. Reminds me why I never wanted to be a slicer." Syal nodded. "Piloting was my forte too, sir." Jag regarded her. "And look at us now, Captain. Piloting our desks. My father said he had to be dragged behind one of these kicking and screaming. I'm thinking maybe I should have kicked and screamed too." "You're young to be commanding a ship," Jag commented. He hoped it sounded like a compliment. "Garrick Lauren thought I was best for the mission," Syal said. "I trust Lauren's judgment. He's a smart man." Jag stroked his beard. Did you want it though? Or would you have preferred to be flying a fighter wing? To be honest, sir, I was getting sick of flying. I wanted a change of pace. And now you want back in the cockpit. I suppose so, sir. Jag smiled. I know exactly how you feel, Captain. And for what it's worth, my father was a frontline man too. He always wanted to be leading the charge, giving example to his troops. Sayal nodded but didn't say anything. Jag was annoyed and couldn't quite say why. He wanted something from Sayal, something besides the commander's subordinate routine. But what? She was his cousin, yes, but what did that mean to a man whose own sister was a stranger? He speaks very highly of your father, Jag ventured. I know they only served together for a short time, but he always told me Wedge Antilles was a fine pilot and a fine man. I was glad to find out both were true. Thank you, Sayal said. Her smile was honest and grateful, but she didn't volunteer any information. Maybe Wedge Antilles had never told his daughters about Baron Sunter Fell. Maybe he had, and it wasn't very good. Jag's father was not the friendliest man in the galaxy. Then, a little awkwardly, she asked, "Is my aunt well?" Of course, the other Sayal, Antilles. The original. I believe so, yes. So Weinsa has told me. I have not actually seen my parents in almost 10 years. Deep sadness showed in Sayal's eyes, but she nodded dutifully. I see, sir. No, they weren't going to get past her today. Jag was disappointed, but not surprised. He didn't know what to make of his cousin, and she didn't know what to make of him. Instead, they both fell back on military formality that ran in their blood. Then he thought of Mary. Clearly it was thicker in some blood than others. How is your sister? Jag asked. Sayal blinked. I think she's catching ragtime now. I can't image what that must have felt like. Your sister coming back from the dead. Jag settled back in his chair, feeling heavy. He would give anything to Davin, Chak, Sim, or Cheris again. Sayal posture relaxed too. Words can't describe. Sir, she said with an open smile. I'm hoping we can get the comm system fixed soon, so I can let our parents know. And, how is your sister, Commander? Jag slumped a little more in his chair. Well, I suppose. I hope. I have some trouble understanding what she's thinking. I know the feeling, said Sayal. But she came back to the nebula to save you? I think that says a lot. Maybe she'd come back for him. Maybe she'd gotten direct orders from Chilla. Jag had no idea. He wanted to believe the former, of course, but when he tried to take himself back 20 years, re-enter the mind of a dogmatic Chiss soldier who'd never met Jaina Solo, he could not be sure. His father had once told him that sometimes in life a man must choose between love and duty. Jag had chosen love, but when? It seemed like all the love had been burned out of her, leaving only duty. Exile does strange things, he muttered. It doesn't just separate you from the people you care about, it separates them from each other. You leave a big gap in people's lives, gaps you don't even think about most of the time, but they are there. And then, he shook his head. The sister I remember from before my exile, and the one I'm working with now might as well be totally different beings, and I can't help but wonder whether I'm at fault somehow. Sayal cleared her throat. Sir, have you tried saying any of this to her? Jag sat upright, jerked out of his reverie. No, Captain. I suppose I haven't. Well, she's your sister, sir. She should be willing to hear you out, at least. Perhaps, Jag admitted. I think that. Suddenly a voice squawked over the room's comm system. Commander Fell, this is the bridge. Commander Fell. Report. Jag and Sayal barked in unison. Commander, Captain. A ship had just dropped into our interdiction field, and is heading this way. A U.S. Henvong ship. Both of them jumped out of their seats. Jag said, put the fleet on red alert. We're on our way. Jag was out in the hallway a second later, his cousin right behind him. Chapter 10. The last time Mary Antilles had been rocked out of bed by an alarm and scrambled to her fighter, it hadn't ended well. This time she had her sister and a whole fleet at her back, so maybe it would go better this time. Maybe. She was comforted by the fact that the Wraiths were not taking the lead on this expedition. Starless scrambled to full fighter squads in addition to the half-dozen pilots in their stealth fighters, including Space Squadron and A-Wing interceptors and Dagger Squadron and U-Wings. The Spades jetted ahead of the other fighters, but even they lagged behind Nave Squadron's U-Wings and a squadron of TIE interceptors from Vindicator. The Imperial ships and the carrier Karuska Gem were closer to the approaching ship and launched their craft first. Myri flicked her comlink to an open channel and picked up the broadbeam transmissions from Nave Leader. U.S. Vong's ship, please identify yourselves. I repeat, if you can hear, please give some indication. Karking good, that'll do. Trey's voice rattled in her ear. Open comm? Smiles, Vort reminded him. Trey shut up and let them listen. Nave Leader repeated his request for identification for about a minute before a now voice cracked over Myri's headset. We are Heart of Flame, seeking assistance, said a voice in guttural basic. Where did you come from, Flame? We come from True Honor. We have fled them. You see, our ship is damaged. Slow your approach, Heart. Please, we request to land on Zanima. Heart, slow your approach and prepare to dock with one of our vessels. No! The voice snapped. Not with Infidel. We will only land on Zanima. Heart, I repeat, slow down or we will open fire. Nave Leader, Jagged Fell's voice filled Myri's ears. Fire a shot over their bow. Copy, Starless. Firing warning shot. In the far distance, past the glow of Space Squadron's burning engines, Myri saw the flash of a few lasers. Starless, she is not slowing. After a short pause, Fell said, aim for her engines. All squads, red alert. Myri saw a few more red darts up ahead as Nave Squadron's U-Wings did their runs on the ship. As far as Myri's eyes and sensors could tell, the ship wasn't firing back. The Naves did one pass, then spun around for another while the A-Wings and TIEs got closer to intercept range. Then there was a bright flash of light. Report. Fell barked. Starless, this is Nave Lead. It just blew. Wait, there's more ships. Myri's scanners blinked, recalibrated, and suddenly reported 4 ships charging toward the planet. 3 U.S. Vong, the other, undetermined. All ships attack. Fell said. Keep them from reaching the planet. You heard him, Fort said. Wraiths, full speed ahead. Myri clicked confirmation and maximized speed. The 4 new ships were charging fast ahead, trailing Heart's debris in their wake. These ones were coming in hot, firing madly, taking 2 of Space Squadron's A-Wings in their initial volley. As they got closer, Myri got a better look at all 4 of them. 3 were the lumpy rock-like ships she expected of the U.S. Vong, but the 4th was something else entirely. It looked like a giant eyeball, connected by pylons branching off either side that in turn fanned out to webbing-like sails. It was utterly bizarre and unlike anything she'd seen before. A full flight of Dagger Squad burst into flame, refocusing Myri's attention. The ships were almost upon them, and they were not slowing down. Wraiths, pulling tight on me, Vort Commander. We're going after the lead shuttle. Myri weaved her ship closer to Vort's, dropping into his lower aft next to Trey's fighter. All 6 stealth fighters pointed their matte black noses at the lead shuttle and charged. Torps, double fire, on my mark, said Vort. Myri dropped her sights on the shuttle. It noticed them and belched flame like projectiles from its forward cannon. Mark. Myri double-tapped her trigger, sending a pair of torps speeding through space. The other Wraiths fired too and pulled up in perfect formation. Explosions seemed to blossom all at once. There was a flash of fire and light right next to Myri, buffeting her craft, while up ahead their torpedoes slammed into the shuttle's forward diving basals, overwhelming them, cracking its Yorick coral hull and spilling it, gush out into space. Even as debris and bodies were flushed out into the vacuum, the shuttle plunged towards Zanima second. Where's Smiles? Rand squawked. I can't see Smiles. Fear effect. Thame snapped. I don't have him either. He was on my wing, Miri said, mouth suddenly dry. She checked her scanner, 4 stealths plus hers. No tray. Did he go EV? Vort asked, voice strangely calm. I got no signal, Thames said. That doesn't mean he's gone, Miri insisted. Alert! Alert! A new voice screamed over her headset. New ships entering the system. Miri wheeled her ship away from the planet and checked her scanners. On the edge of the gravity well, ships were popping in one after another and approaching at best sublight speed. A glance at scanners told it all. Imperial-class Star Destroyer, Nebula-class Star Destroyer, 3 Marauder corvettes, 2 Lancer frigates, 2 Bothan assault cruisers, 2 Mon Cal ships, another Imp Star. Oh, Miri rasped. Oh, Sith spawn. As they wheeled to face the coming onslaught, their old quarry charged onward to Zanima II. As Philaire stood on Chimera's bridge, watching the battle unfold, she couldn't help but feel like her entire life had been leading to this moment. Her childish dreams of fighting for the Empire, her hard labors at the Academy, her early service, the assignment to Trinity, Justifier's blazing destruction, and her hard choice in Dalla's holding cell, all of it had led her here. While Dalla hovered close to the tactical holo, commanding the larger fleet movements, Philaire stayed in the crew pit near the navigation station. Lieutenant, she told the chief helmsman, take us closer to the Chiss vessel. Prepare a firing solution. Yes, ma'am. Contact the main flight bay. Tell them to launch squadrons 1, 3, 4, and 5. Keep the others on standby. Yes, ma'am. Philaire held her breath as he relayed her orders without hesitation. She still could not believe she was here, commanding this legendary ship, giving orders and watching them be obeyed without hesitation. The deck rocked, tipping her against the back of the helmsman's chair and dispelling her disbelief. This was not a dream come true. This was a deadly combat zone, and she had to get used to it. Damage team, report, she said. Negative. Just fire on our port shields. Source. Chiss Clawcraft from Celestial. 3 squads. Have squads 4 and 5 screen them. Call new order for assistance. Yes, ma'am. Philaire moved down to the end of the crew pit, clambered up the ladder, and stepped onto the main deck near the tactical station. Good, Dalla said when she saw her. Don't be afraid to let your crew know you're willing to get in the pit with them. Thank you, she nodded. What's the status? The U.S. Hinvong ships have broken their fighter screen and are heading for the planet, Dalla said. But they don't matter. We can't take care of them once we kill the enemy fleet. Philaire scanned the tactical holo. Trinity had already lost several ships in previous engagements, and what she had left was formidable, but not as impressive as the combined renegade fleets. As she watched, the markers representing Phoenix, Philaire, and Dayrilland were vectoring for Jagged Fell's flagship. Captain Pavrick's carrier Karuska Gem was spilling out an entire wing of fighters, but his actual batteries were no match for those of Niathal and Lacenta closing in. Captain Omphlam's Mondromeda was being protected by Captain Theron's Liberty Star, but 1 Star Destroyer would not be enough to protect the Interdictor from Revolutionary, Sunbeam, and 2 additional Corellian gunships. Closer to Chimera, Captain Vernad's Vindicator and his flanking anti-starfighter frigates were tangling with the Star Destroyer Resolve and Dalla's 3 Marauder-class corvettes. Vernadette, an old human man, had shown no qualms with taking orders from a young Twi'lek woman, and Philaire felt sad to think that he may soon be killed. She felt sad thinking of Jagged Fell and the others too. She bore no ill will to the crew of Trinity Fleet. You can't hesitate, Dalla said, as if sensing her thoughts. These are people, Philaire said, not U.S. Hinvong. They are protecting the Vong, and that makes them the enemy. Dalla said firmly. Jagged Fell is a good man, but his misplaced idealism threatens the entire galaxy. The bridge shook as a turbolaser volley from Celestial scattered over their forward shields. Chimera returned its own fire, and the battle was on. We have to offer him the chance to surrender, she told Dalla. We will, the old woman nodded. But he won't take it. He's too honorable. I know, Philaire said gravely. Something flashed on the tactical holo. The Trinity frigate Nova Burn crumpled under fire from Resolve and exploded. She could see its dying flare distantly through the forward viewport. Philaire's mouth went dry. Captain Orville. Nearly 300 good men and women, humans and aliens, all of whom had trusted her just a few days ago. Chimera shuddered under another volley from Celestial. Dala laid a firm hand on her shoulder and said, "This is the way it has to be, Captain." Philaire nodded and blinked a little moisture from her eye. "Admiral, I think we should recall Resolve." Dala glanced at the holo where the Star Destroyer was now exchanging direct fire with Captain Bernadette's ship in an equally matched brawl. "Celestial is giving us a heavy slugging, Admiral. If we combine our fire and our starfighter screens, we should be able to take it out. Winesafel is a more important target than Bernadette." Dala considered, then said, "I'll give the order." Philaire felt breath escape her lungs as Resolve left Vindicator to fend off the buzzing marauders and made a line for Chimera and Celestial. She was going to fight and kill people she'd worked with, she accepted that, but she didn't want to kill any more Imperials, especially good men like Bernadette. As for Jagged Fell's sister, well, they had never seemed close anyway. She glanced at the tactical holo. Another light winked out. In the far distance, Liberty Star smoldered, burned, and died. Philaire was sure there'd be more of that to come. Jagged's heart jumped in his throat as Captain Theron's holo image suddenly winked out. He turned away from the comm station, stalked past Starless's main tactical holo, and watched it with his own eyes. Revolutionary was an old Victory-class destroyer, and Sunbeam was just a Majestic-class cruiser, but together they had managed to overwhelm the larger Liberty Star. Revolutionary poured a volley of turbolaser fire that collapsed her shields while K-wing bombers from Sunbeam lobbed torpedoes right into her bridge. The entire command tower had disintegrated, trailing smoke and debris as the rest of Liberty Star began to drift in space. Mondromeda waited helplessly while Sunbeam, Revolutionary, and the two gunships circled it like hungry vultures. Jag wanted to do something, anything to save Captain Omflam, but he had no ships to spare. There was nothing to do except watch him die. "Commander," Traz Creffy called from the tactical station. "Resolve has broken away from Vindicator. She's heading for Celestial." Suddenly it all vanished from his awareness. The clamor on the bridge, the three capital ships looming toward him, the firefight scattered around Zanamaseket's orbit, the U.S. Hinvong ships on the ground, the men and women dying by the hundreds. Everything was reduced to Winesafel. Jag hurried back to the communication station. "Get me a channel to Commodore Fell. Now." "Yes, Commander," the lieutenant said. 30 seconds felt like forever until his sister's blurry blue holo image appeared where, just a minute ago, the late Captain Theron had been. "Commodore, there's another Star Destroyer heading your way," he said. "You have to disengage from Chimera and get out of there. Now." "We've seen it and are taking appropriate measures," Wynn said. Her voice was controlled, but her image was rent by bursts of static. Every time it disappeared, Jag's heart stopped beating, afraid that what had just happened to Theron would happen to his sister. "Commodore," he insisted, "pull back and help defend Jim." "That's an order." Wines's image blurred, and static crackled over her words. When she came back, she said, "Room for maneuverability. If we try to flee, we'll expose our aft." "Just do it." Jagged shouted so loud the whole bridge could hear. "Fall back. Fall back now." "We'll comply," Wynn said curtly. "Celestial out." Jag stalked back to the tactical holo, hoping to get a better view of his sister's retreat. When he saw it, a sense of dread took hold of his body. Resolve was already within firing range, heaping laser on Celestial's flank while Chimera continued to pound its front. The Chiss vessel was tough, but it was no match for two Imperial-class Star Destroyers. Weinstein didn't have a chance. Jag stared at the holo, frozen in a state of helplessness. He could only think, it wasn't fair. He'd lost Davin and Cheris when he was a child, Sim and Chak when he was an adult, and each time their deaths had been relayed by a holo message, or the impersonal declaration of some Chiss officer. Now when his last sibling was about to be killed before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do. He went back to the front viewport, maneuvering dazed through the scrambling bridge crew. He squinted at the fire in the distance, desperate to see it with his own eyes. 2 Star Destroyers were pouring blazing green plasma at one battered target. He saw the first spikes of flame as they tore through the shields and began ripping up the ship, exposing its guts to vacuum, burning away its oxygen, and twisting its superheated durasteel hull to mangled wreckage. "Commander," a voice said softly behind him, "Celestial's engines are down. So are her shields." Jagged looked over his shoulder to see Sayal Antilles. Her face was dark with bitter understanding. "Thank you, Captain," he rasped. He couldn't manage any more. "Commander," Creffy called from the tactical station, "Chimera is sending boarding parties. Celestial is starting to fire escape pods and deploy shuttles, but the Imps still have a strong fighter screen going. They won't get far." Wynn would never abandon ship. He knew that. Still, he lurched back to the communication station. He had the tiniest, flimsiest spark of hope, and he had to follow where it led, no matter how painful. After an excruciating minute, the comm officer was able to get a signal to Celestial. His sister stood on the before him one last time, image torn by static. "Wynn," he said, "you have to get out. Get out now. Dallas sending boarding parties. She probably wants to raid the ship." "We know," Weinstein said coolly. "We're securing all special cargo now." Alpha read. He hadn't even thought about it since the battle started. Jack shook his head and said, "Wynn, you have to get out of there. Dala will capture you. Believe me, you don't want that." "I will never be taken alive," Weinstein said firmly. "I've just activated the self-destruction within this ship." Of course. Jag had been away from the Chiss so long that he'd forgotten. All major warships were built with self-destruct systems to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. It was the sort of thing to expect from the Chiss, secretive and ruthless. Suddenly Sayal Antilles appeared behind him. She said over his shoulder, "Commodore Fell, the knowledge you have is just as valuable as the special cargo. If the mission is to continue, we need you." "There is no mission left," Weinstein said bitterly. Jag couldn't argue. Trinity was crumbling under the sustained onslaught of the combined renegade fleets. Unless Zanima II managed to perform one of his miracles, they would be forced to either surrender or die within the next hour. "Commodore," Sayal pressed, "staying on that ship is the same as death." Weinstein looked frustrated. "It is the captain's duty to see to the well-being of every being on her ship. I must oversee the evacuation. I cannot abandon my crew, Captain." "Then slag your duty. What about your brother?" "Captain Antilles, please," Jack said. He felt something wet in his eye. He blinked it away, faced Weinstein's blurring image, and said, "Don't do it for me, Wynn. Think of father. Think of mother. She doesn't deserve to lose her last child." "I am not her last child," said Wynn. "They lost me a long time ago." Jack shook his head. "Please, Wynn." Static overcame the image, and for a horrible drawn-out moment he thought she might be gone forever. Then she appeared again. Through the blurry holo it was hard to tell, but she almost looked contrite. "Even if we get to the shuttles, they have a fighter screen," Wynn said. "We can't break through that." "You'll have help," Sayal said. "I promise." Wynn flickered again, came back. She nodded and said, "We will try. Celestial out." And then she was gone. Jack stared at the turned-off console for a long moment. His mind was empty. His body felt slack, like it was going to fall over forever. Then somebody from across the bridge reported, "Phoenix is approaching, 3 minutes to firing range." Jack turned around and stared at the chaotic scene on Starless's bridge. Sayal, standing next to him, placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll need to send a fighter screen to help cover them. The closest friendly is probably Vindicator, so we'll send them to Vernadin." "What fighters?" Jack croaked. "I'll send the daggers, spades, torches, and the wraiths. We can't spare those." Jag waved hand at the tactical holo. We have a Star Destroyer and 2 Bothan cruisers inbound. We need something to defend with. We'll think of something. Right now, Weinson needs help. Sayal squeezed his shoulder. Besides, I think Miri owes me a favor. Chapter 11. The first hints of dawn were creeping through the eastern sky. The veils of mist that hung between the mountains was turning shades of gray, silver, and blue. It was a sunrise unlike anything Tahiri had seen in a very long time. Indeed, she wanted to savor it, but she felt anxious. The Force was speaking to her, but she couldn't tell what it was saying. She sensed confusion and pain somewhere, not on this mountain clearing with the U.S. Hinvong, but somewhere far away. That could have meant elsewhere on the planet, or it could have meant halfway across the galaxy. She wished, very badly, that she had taken some kind of long-range transmitter up the mountain. As it was, it rested with the shuttle in the bottom of the valley, and she had no intention of attempting that dangerous trek until daylight had fully crested the mountain peaks. She stood in the clearing and watched the dark sky, half expecting something to come out of it. Cadre Val and Scott were resting in the sleeping bags brought from the shuttle, having finally worn themselves out with Shaper talk. Vletham and Nerith were curled up, asleep or at least unmoving, while Varioshe prepared a morning fire. Keelaquad was inside her demudec, doing who knew what. None of them seemed agitated like she was, but she reminded herself that this was to be expected. For a long time, she'd been around Jedi and assumed Jedi-like abilities and traits from those around her. Now, after less than a day surrounded by U.S. Hinvong, she was still getting reacquainted with their very different set of abilities. Varioshe was putting the last few branches on the burning pit when Keelaquad emerged from her demudec. The Shaper half stumbled outside. Her long neck was bent back, and she was staring up at the pre-dawn sky. "What is it?" Tahiri asked in U.S. Hinvong. "What do you see?" "Nothing," the old Shaper hissed. "But my biots, my guardians, they sense something approach." Scott and Cadre Val, alerted by their speech, stirred within their sleeping bags. Tahiri pulled her lightsaber off her belt. "I feel a disturbance in the Force. I can't tell where it is." As she spoke, an icy sensation stabbed her awareness. She sensed cold, brooding determination that screamed Sith. There was no Sith-like anger. Its icy intent and cutting ruthlessness reverberated with power of the dark side. "They're coming," Tahiri muttered, shocked back to speaking in basic. Scott said, flinging back his sheets. "There." Keelaquad stabbed a finger up at the sky. Tahiri stared, squinted, but saw nothing. "What about those defenses?" Scott sounded on the verge of panic. "Can't they stop it?" Tahiri saw 2 flashes in the sky, then a third. Flares seemed to fall from a point overhead, tracing brilliant arcs as they fell toward the base of the mountain. Before they could reach the forest, they flared again, then dissolved into darkness. "What was that?" Cadre Val said as she rose to her feet. "No," Keelaquad said, visibly stunned. "It can't be." "What can't be?" Tahiri snapped. "He seeded my forest." Keelaquad's shock turned to anger. "He put my pets to sleep." "You mean we're defenseless?" Scott looked around. "Who's coming?" "Vilith Dow," Cadre Val said bitterly. "It has to be." Tahiri understood it all in an instant. Somehow, for some reason, Keelaquad's ex-apprentice was coming back for her, and this time he wasn't going to take no for an answer. And this time, he was bringing Sith. Tahiri's lightsaber hummed to life. She heard the sound of an aircraft rending atmosphere, but no scream of engines, which meant a U.S. Hinvong ship. She stared upward again, and finally saw the lumpy shape of a U.S. Hinvong shuttle resolving out of the dim western sky. Twin bursts of flame shot from the nose of the shuttle. Tahiri ducked instinctively, as did the others, but the burning rockets shot over their heads. Before Tahiri could stand and recover, the shuttle swung low over the mountainside clearing with the silent agility of a coral skipper. A half-dozen figures flung themselves out of the hole in the port side of the shuttle. Scott was scrambling for his blaster, and Nerith and Cadre Val snapped their amphistaffs to life. Keelaquad stood frozen beneath the shuttle as 6 black forms fell to earth around her. A blood-red lightsaber blade flared to life, and Tahiri charged. Before she could get close, a blast of force energy knocked her off her feet. The U.S. Hinvong, unaffected, ran forward to be met by 5 of their own. As Tahiri scrambled back up, she saw a tall figure in a Shaper's headdress wrap an arm around Keela Quad's shoulders. The old Shaper kicked and struggled, and Vario Shay moved in to help her. One U.S. Hinvong in warrior armor moved to block him, and Shay whipped his amphistaff around the warrior's legs, knocking him to the ground. Before he could raise his staff back up, a brilliant red saber blade flashed through the night, and Vario Shay's head tumbled from his shoulders and hit the damp earth with a sickening thunk. Nerith and Vletham shouted in fury and charged forward. Other warriors moved to block them while the Sith turned to face Tahiri. The red glow of his lightsaber revealed a hideous face, laced with red and black tattoos and some elaborate tribal pattern, topped by a pair of devilish horns. Tahiri charged across the clearing, and the Sith charged to meet her. Their sabers clashed in the dark, hissing and spitting sparks and flashes of light. This Deveronian in swirling black robes was half a meter taller than her, almost twice as big. He pressed his saber against hers and knocked her back a full step. She pulled back, ducked beneath the wide horizontal swung, and stabbed at his legs. She scored a shallow blow at his left calf, and he jumped back, hissing. Behind him, Tahiri saw the 2 Shapers being pulled into the belly of the shuttle, and she knew she was already lost. The other U.S. Hinvong were still fighting beneath the hovering shuttle. She heard Scott's blaster pistol go off but didn't see any bolts. One U.S. Hinvong gored another with an amphistaff, but she couldn't tell who fell and who killed. It flashed by in an instant. Then the Sith was on her. He was bigger than her, stronger than her, probably more powerful in the Force too. His heavy blows knocked her back, 1 step, 2, 3, toward the edge of the clearing. In desperation and despair, she tried to summon the bitterness and anger that had fueled her as Darth Ketis's apprentice. Both came easily. Keela Quad was already captured. She'd failed, yet again, just like she failed Anakin, failed Nin Yim, failed Jaina, and Anakin's parents, failed everyone who ever believed in her or thought she could be something other than a billion broken pieces. She pressed forward, lightsaber moving faster than the Sith's. She knocked him back 2 steps and took another swipe at his legs. He jumped over her blade, swung his own down like a cleaver. She dropped, rolled, leaving saber-scorched earth behind. She came out of her roll and spun back to face the Sith, lightsaber raised, and was thrown into the forest by another Force blast. Tahiri tumbled through the dark, lightsaber spinning out of her hand. The tree knocked her shoulder, her head hit the dirt. She slammed into a fallen log and stayed there for a second and forever, dazed and pained and blind in the dark. She reached out with the Force, felt her lightsaber, turned it to life and called it to her hand. Its blue blade wheeled through the forest, slicing through branches and twigs, and its handle slapped into her hand just as the devil horn Sith fell on her like a bird of prey. She deflected his blade but pinned to the base of the log it was all she could do. Blue and red blades flashed in the dark, sparking, echoing through the dark woods. Every blow seemed to stab her deeper into the ground. Her arms ached. Her hands stung. She didn't know how long she could hold. Suddenly the Sith reared back, shouted. He spun to see what was behind him, and Tahiri saw the red of his lightsaber illuminate the hideous, deformed face of Lethan. The extolled raised one deformed, claw-like hand in defense, while the other brought an amphistaff round for another strike. The Sith brought his lightsaber down in one underhanded swing, effortlessly cutting Vletham in half. "No!" Tahiri screamed and charged forward. Another failure, another life lost because of her. She didn't have the strength for anger anymore, only bitterness and despair. She swung wildly at the Sith, but he held his ground. He blocked 2 blows, 3, then stabbed his blade forward, taking her in the side. Pain shot up from beneath her rib cage, and she screamed in hot agony. She fell back, only to slam into the thick trunk of a tree. Her lightsaber hung at her side, and she hadn't the strength to lift it. The Sith before her raised his weapon and charged for the killing strike. "Live," A voice screamed in her mind. The Sith seemed to freeze mid-blow. Her awareness reached out, her force and her Vong sense both. The two halves of her, so separate always, seemed unified and whole. With the force she watched him charge, slowly. With her Vong sense, she summoned Vletham's amphistaff to her free hand. Strength came to her from nowhere and her arm shot up. The Sith's blade hissed and crackled against the amphistaff held high over her head. For a moment she saw the Sith's face in the light of his sparking lightsaber, and she caught the shock in his eyes. Then her lightsaber whipped up. The Sith's knees went slack. His lightsaber fell from his hand. His horn head tumbled off his shoulders, rolled downhill, and was lost in the brush. Tahiri stood in the dark forest, panting. She felt a dim sensation, like a hand brushing her cheek. Live, the voice in her head said again. She knew in her heart it was Anakin's. When she was ready, she staggered back up the hill by the light of her saber. When she got to the clearing, the shuttle was gone, and so was Keela Quad. 4 U.S. Hinvong bodies were sprawled in the clearing, Varioche's headless corpse among them. Scott was there too, shifting and moaning in pain while Kodra Val tried to do something for his leg. Nerith stood at the mouth of Quad's Demudek with an empty look in his eyes. Tahiri shut off her lightsaber. To the east, mist glowed with the light of dawn. At the hyperdrive shafts, they at least got a warning. What good it would do, Venku wasn't sure. He knew that he, for one, was not in any condition to fight off an invasion by whoever was coming for them. Shrill alert sirens wailed through the air. People swarmed around the 3 shuttles on the landing pad, stuffing them full of supplies in preparation for an emergency retreat. There was no way to fit everyone and everything in the, and anyone able-bodied and capable of fighting was being asked to stay here and defend the hyperdrive cores. You sure you don't want to go, Katika? Muriel asked from his side. Venku looked at the old clone. You sure you don't? Muriel laughed. Just a few days back I bagged me a moth. I can't handle a few Von Gays. That was Muriel, of course, brash and bragging to the end. He looked to see Gada walking across the landing bay from the command center. Bess, Gendry, and Jaina Solo were not far behind. Oya Bartica, Muriel called. You taking the last ship out? Gada had his eyes on Venku. I think I'll be staying here. I already explained, Jaina said. I need Bess and Gendry here. We don't have many people who can fight. What's the matter, Jedi? Muriel crossed his arms over his armored chest. Think I'm too old to bust some Vongese gets. I won't make you. Jaina looked at Venku. I won't make you either. I won't leave my people behind, Venku said firmly. He might not be able to run and gun, but he figured he could sit and snipe if he had to. Okay, Jaina sighed. Well, they should be here any minute. I want you at defensive positions along the north engine's rim. What are we looking at here? Muriel asked. Vanjis. Dala. 1 U.S. Hinvong landing ship, she said grimly. Ha! Muriel barked. I can't eat one of those for breakfast. It's afternoon, Babur, Gendry muttered. Hey now, Muriel spun on him. I'll have you know. Fearfeck, Jaina said. Incoming, 7 o'clock. All eyes went to the sky above. Something had pierced the cloud layer. From here it looked like a dark oval hovering over the landscape, but it was getting incrementally larger. Stations, Jaina commanded. Now. As Jaina darted off, Bess looked up at the sky, sighed, and said, I wish they'd let me keep my bye. No kidding, Muriel grunted. Venku knew the feeling. All he had were the lightsabers at his hip and the Verpine sniper rifle slung over his shoulder. Normally the Verp's targeting system patched directly into his helmet HUD, but since they left their base back at the village, he'd have to use the built-in scope. Bess and Gendry broke into a jog, quick but not so fast it left the old guys breathing dust. Venku could walk fast so long as he was on even ground, and that's what he did now, as the second shuttles kicked up air and pushed themselves off the landing pad. Isn't this Shabla planet supposed to defend itself? Muriel said as they reached the rim of the north engine well. Only when it wants to, apparently, Gadab said. What kind of deal is that? Muriel said as he checked the gas canister in his Blast Tech E67 carbine. Don't ask me. Will of the Force. You getting anything? Muriel looked to Gadab, then Venku. From the Force, I mean. Gadab shook his head, Venku too. The old clone swore, then lay his body flat along the thick metal edge of the shaft. There was a railing all around to prevent people from just tumbling in, but if you went down on your belly you had enough space to squeeze head, shoulders, and the rest of you through. But that was the last thing Venku wanted. He tried a short trot along the rim but found himself exhausted after just 20 meters. That still gave him a different angle of fire from Gadab and Muriel, so he dropped to his belly and prepped his rifle. The clone and the ex-Jedi were doing the same, while Gendry and Bess rode the lift down several levels into the shaft to join with some of the other defenders. Venku spared a moment to wonder where Jaina Solo had gone off to. Then the attack began. The U.S. Hinvong shuttle swung over the south engine first. It however for a moment around the base of the vane, some 30 meters over the mouth of the shaft, and dropped 24 U.S. Hinvong paratroopers like seed spores. It swung over to the north shaft to do the same, but at least they had a warning. Venku rolled on his back and began firing manually upward at the shuttle as it passed. Gadab, Muriel, and the other defenders on top did the same. Laser blasts smoked the rock-like hull of the shuttle, and when the portal opened on its starboard side to let the paratroopers fall, the Mandas concentrated all the fire they had on it. Two Vongese got riddled in the chest and fell into the bottomless shaft without even firing their chutes. Venku rolled onto his belly, brought up the scope, and plugged another in his big ugly forehead right as he fell into the mouth of the shaft. Others kept falling and began throwing down their explosive thud bugs at Gendry, Bess, and the other defenders inside the shaft. The handheld laser fire had apparently damaged the shuttle. It wobbled soundlessly over the north shaft, then lurched away. Venku rolled onto his back again to track it and saw that it was heading for the central vein. Thunder clapped and shockwave tore through the air. He heard Muriel give a surprised yelp as a concussion mission tore through the Vongese shuttle. It dropped like a rock in the middle of the landing bay, pouring black smoke into the sky. Venku adjusted his position to see the big Wookiee with the shoulder-mount missile launcher standing at the entrance to the command center, waving a furry fist in the air and roaring victoriously. Then 3 black streaks raced out of the burning wreckage, faster than any human or Vong. The Wookiee was thrown to the ground and let out a scream of pain. A group of humans burst out of the command center's blast doors, dropped to their knees, and began firing at whatever black beasts had burst onto the scene. They looked like some mad hybrid between a lizard and an AKK dog, with 3 canted legs on either side, furry bodies, scaled muscular tails, and wide flat snouts with toothy, snapping jaws. They tore down one human, then another. Venku gaped in awe and horror, not even paying attention to the fight in the shaft. He brought up his rifle, stared through the scope, though he had no hope of actually nailing of these monsters. Then, staring through the scope of his rifle, he saw the flash of a blue lightsaber blade. He'd seen Jaina Solo fight before, but not like this. She moved like an airborne acrobat, a blur of dark camo jumpsuit and dark brown hair, leaping, spinning, thrusting, barely touching ground. She sheared off all 3 legs from one side of a monster, sending it thrashing helplessly on the ground while the soldiers poured laser fire down its gaping, howling mouth. She went after another monster, slicing at its tail to get its attention. Its massive body wheeled around with incredible speed, and it vomited something from its open mouth. Solo leaped, dodging it, and threw herself over the back of the monster, trailing a streak of smoke and gore with her lightsaber. The monster howled, screamed, thrashed. A soldier, too close, was literally torn in half by its whipping tail. The other soldiers kept firing, and Jaina threw herself in the air one last time, coming down saber first, stabbing it right through the top of its head. For a moment she froze, lightsaber buried to the hilt right between its eyes, blowing blue tip jutting out of its throat. Then she pulled her saber out, jumped off, and let the monster collapse lifeless on the gore and debris-strewn landing pad. He couldn't see the last one. Katika. Someone shouted, "Got up or Mariel?" He pulled his eye away from the scope just in time to see it charging at him from his right flank. He froze, dead stopped, as the monster bore down on him with jaws open wide. Something slammed into the monster, knocking it off course. Its 6 legs scrambled for purchase as Gadab dug his lightsaber into the monster's side. It locked, somehow, between the beast's armored plating, and as the old man struggled to wrench it free, the monster's body twisted. Its tail whipped around, and its tip snapped through Gadab's left calf. Venku heard a sickening crunch, heard the old man wail, and saw him pitch forward. The monster spun on Gadab, Venku forgotten, and opened his hungry mouth. Then Jaina Solo was there. She threw herself at his other side and sliced off one leg. The monster roared and tried to take her down with his whipping tail. Venku, finally, scrambled to his feet. His balance was poor, his chest breathless, but he plucked his mother's lightsaber from his belt and threw himself at the animal. It was so distracted by Jaina and Gadab that it had forgotten its original quarry. He thrust both blades into his side, one of them digging deeper into the wound Gadab had already made. The beast screamed, struggled. Jaina Solo leaped forward one more time, thrust her saber right into the monster's eye and spearing hot energy through his brain. The massive body suddenly went limp and collapsed on the ground. Venku and Jaina stared at each other over the dead monster's back, breathless, thankful it was finally over. Then Gadab screamed. They whirled in unison to see a U.S. Hanvong warrior standing over the old man, amethyst staff driven, in between the armor plates on his back, pinning him to the ground. Gadab, face down, writhed in agony as the Vong pulled the staff out of his gut with a sicking sound. Behind him, another was climbing out of the shaft. Venku roared and charged. Lost in unthinking rage, he slashed with both sabers, knocking the Vong's amethyst staff out of his hand. He kept hacking, tearing one arm off his shoulder, scoring a deep gouge in his side. Finally, he brought both sabers to bear and tore his head from his shoulders. Behind it, the other Vong tumbled to the ground, blaster smoke pouring from the back of his head. Mariel was already getting to his feet and running for Gadab. All 3 of them converged on the old man. Jaina rolled him over, carefully, but blood was already spilling out from beneath him. His wrinkled old face was twisted in pain, but Jaina grabbed one hand, held it tight. Mariel bent over him, muttering, "Bartika, Bartika, don't go, Bartika." Venku only stared, wordless, breathless, and helpless. He could feel it. He could feel him fading in the Force. This man who had trained him, saved him over and over, guided him since he was a very small child, and he knew there was nothing he could do. He grabbed Gadab's free hand and squeezed it. It wasn't enough, but it was all he had. Then the ground started to rumble, and he knew things were going to get even worse. Some deep and awful roaring sounded within the engine shafts. A sound filled the air, like the sky being torn in two. He stared up. They all stared up, even as Gadab died before them. It looked like a knife had torn through the clouds overhead, and the sky beyond was changing colors before his eyes. Even before she got to Ben, Vestera knew something had gone wrong. The initial plan, as she understood it, was to send 4 assault teams to strike different locations on Zanima Sekhet. One shuttle, loaded with Voxen and U.S. Hanvong warriors, had been sent to disable the planet's hyperdrive core and prevent it from fleeing. The second had been sent to the mountaintop sanctuary where some U.S. Hanvong shaper was hiding. Vilith Dowell and Darth Vidia spearheaded that attack. Another attack team had been sent to ravage the largest settlement in the far distance, but it had been shot out of the sky during the initial approach on Zanima Sekhet. The 4th team, riding not a U.S. Hanvong shuttle but the ancient Sith meditation sphere, was Vestera's own. She did not have to direct the vessel or search out Ben through the Force. Somehow, Ship knew exactly where he would be. It plunged into the planet's atmosphere and crept into his night side shadow, so eager to find his former master that Vestera felt vaguely insulted. As Ship approached the village where Ben must be, she felt a stab of pain through the Force. Somehow, deep inside, She understood that Darth Vidius was dead. She didn't know how she knew the Devaronian Sith Lord had been no mentor to her like Lady Rhea, but he'd at least been a guy for a short time, close enough to create a bond in the Force. But she knew he was dead, which meant the mission to capture the Shaper had probably gone bad too. Vestera focused on the pain, drew strength from it. She'd lost so much already. Vidius was just fuel to the fire that would power her onward. Through ship's translucent walls, Vestera could see the faint lights of a village below, strewn out along what looked to be a small valley. The 4 Yuuzhan Vong warriors crammed inside the ship with her stirred anxiously, clutching their amphistaffs to their chests. Vestera still felt strange and nervous with these beings she could not sense in the Force, but so far they'd shown no sign of turning on her. They knew, without fully understanding why, that the one Sith and true honor had conjoined fates, and one fell and rose with the other. In that, they were just like Vestera. Ship dove deep, hungry. His voice echoed in Vestera's mind. He is here? Here. Okay, Vestera muttered. Take me to him. The Yuuzhan Vong stared at her but said nothing. Ship swooped in low over the village, over low dome-shaped buildings lit from inside by burning fires. The entire scene was shockingly primitive, and Vestera felt a surge of excitement. If this village, this whole planet, was still living in the Dark Ages, overtaking it should be easy. The rear portal of the meditation sphere suddenly opened, blowing cool, fresh air into the ship. The Yuuzhan Vong let out a war cry and hurled themselves into the street. Vestera looked around ship's empty interior, said, "Wait here," and threw herself after them. At this time of the night, the street was indeed empty. The warriors charged out to cause havoc, which was all their mission entailed. They were a distraction, a way to keep this village confused while she sought out Ben. She stood beneath the hovering sphere, red lightsaber ignited before her, and reached out with the Force, trying to pick up his familiar Force signature. She found the faint life signals of non-Jedi, but nothing similar to the one she'd known so well, cherished, loved in her moments of weakness. "Where is he?" she said aloud, looking up at Ship. "You said he was here." "He vanished," it said, like a blinking eye. "What?" She spat angrily. "What does that mean? Is he here, or isn't he?" Then she heard it, the snap hiss hum of a lightsaber coming to life. She turned and saw a figure standing in the entrance to a low domed building, holding a glowing blade before it. Vestera stepped closer, reached out with the Force. This was not Ben's lightsaber, and it was not Ben. She stepped closer, and in the figure's silhouette saw the shape of a woman, tall, long pale hair pulled off of her face. This woman was touching on the Force, drawing strength from it, but in a feeble half-trained way. "Who are you?" Vestera said as she stepped closer. She held her blade in front of her but did not slow in caution. Whatever this woman was, Vestera wasn't scared of her. "Stay back," the woman said. The fear in her voice was obvious. Vestera snorted. "You're not a Jedi." "I'm not," the woman admitted. "Where did you get that lightsaber?" "It's mine." Vestera shook her head. "You don't want to cross me. Just tell me where Ben Skywalker is. That's all I want." Somewhere in the distance, people began to scream. The woman's lightsaber dropped slightly as she strained to hear, and Vestera chose that moment to strike. The woman held up her saber to block one blow, then another. Vestera forced her back so her shoulder blades pressed against the frame of the door. Vestera grinned. It wasn't often she got to pin down someone weaker than her, someone utterly at her mercy. It was a good feeling, and she savored it. "Where's Ben Skywalker? Tell me, or I'll kill you." The woman snarled and took a swing at Vestera. Her thoughts bled into the Force, and her attacks were easy to counter. The Sith sidestepped the blow and gave the woman a lazy, easy jab in the thigh. The woman screamed and dropped her lightsaber. She slumped against the doorframe, clutching her smoking leg. "Is that all you can stand?" Vestera hissed. "What kind of fake Jedi are you?" She held a hand before her and pinched two fingers together. The woman rose slowly into the air and her hands clawed vainly at her throat. Her head tilted back and choking sounds escaped her mouth as Vestera squeezed her trachea tighter and tighter until it was on the verge of snapping. Then, behind her, snap his hum. Vestera tossed the woman to the ground and turned around. There he was, standing in the middle of the street, right beneath Ship. He had a violet blade, but she knew it was Ben. However, he'd hidden himself before. He now screamed at her through the force. "Hello, Ben?" Vestera raised her lightsaber and stepped slowly toward him. "It's been a while." "Not long enough, Vez," Ben said. "I'm not trying to kill you," she said. "Then don't make me kill you," Ben said. She could hear his honesty, feel his emotions in the force. He was ready to fight her, but he was not willing to kill her, and that was why he would lose. She lunged, taking a swipe at his legs. Ben blocked, skirted back. They circled each other beneath Ship, and the meditation sphere's thoughts echoed in both their minds. Good, it goaded them. Anger, pain, suffering, give each other what you deserve. "Shut up," Ben hissed. "I should have Karking left you on Zias. That was to be our fate, Ben Skywalker. Together we three are to find the end of the Jedi and the new beginning of the Sith." "Not likely," Ben said, and lunged at Vestera. He went for her legs too, and she pushed his blade aside with her own. They traded quick feints, always aiming for limbs, neither willing to strike at vital organs. "You don't have to do this, Vez," Ben said. If he thought she was taking it easy on him because she was soft, well, good. She could turn that to her advantage. She lunged forward and swung low, like she wanted to cut his legs off at the thigh. He blocked and gave her a forced shove, knocking her 3 steps back. He lunged after her, thrusting at her. She sidestepped and swiped down where his leg should have been, but he rolled to avoid her. He kicked up dirt as he rose back to his feet and spun around to block her downward swing. That one would have taken him right in the face, but he caught her blade with his own. "Come on, Vez," Ben hissed. "I don't know who's making you do this, but you don't have to." Could he know about Crate, about the strange dreams the Dark Lord had as he floated between death and life? No, impossible. Yet doubt flicked through her doubt of Ben, doubt of her own willingness to deliver him to the dragon, and in that moment Ben pushed against her blade. His 2 arms were stronger than her one, and she stumbled back. Ben swiped horizontally at her midsection, cutting right above her hand. Her lightsaber sparked, flashed, and her blade died. She threw the smoking thing to the ground and suddenly stood before Ben, helpless. Ben took a step closer. He held out his spare hand while keeping his lightsaber ignited at his side. "Come on, Vez," he said. "You don't want to kill me, and I don't want to kill you. We can give this all up, Vez. All this Sith and Jedi stuff. Just live like people. That's what you always wanted, isn't it?" Vestera shook her head violently. "No. You're a fool. You don't understand." "Yes, I do, Vez." The violet blade of his lightsaber receded, disappeared, and he stood before her as a dirty, panting, tired young man with pleading eyes. It was tempting, so tempting, to reach out and take his hand. Half her soul cried to do so. She didn't know what she'd do afterward, where they'd go together, but she knew it would be far, far away from all of this. "But Lady Kai," Ship said, "that is not your destiny." She reached out with the force. The blonde woman's lightsaber, lying discarded in the dirt, hissed to life. It flew through the air, a wheel of deadly light heading straight at Ben's flank. He pivoted and brought his own saber to life just in time to deflect it and send it spinning back into the street. It cut up a trail of dust before his light winked out. By then, Vestera was on him. She didn't even use the force. She came at him from the side when he was distracted and slammed a knee upright between his legs. He wheezed, dropped his lightsaber. She cracked an elbow right in his forehead, and the great heir to the Jedi Order collapsed in the dust like a sack of vegetables. Good, Ship cried gleefully. "Come, Lady Kai. There is not much time." Vestera picked up Ben's lightsaber and hooked it on her belt. Then she picked up Ben's limp body with the force and floated it into Ship's open portal. With a short force-propelled hop, she landed herself inside too. "We must go, Lady Kai." Ship had suddenly gone from gleeful to panicked, and Vestera's sense of triumph disappeared. "What about the Vong?" she asked. She could still hear them attacking villagers somewhere in the distance. "No time," Ship cried, and suddenly it flew into the air. The force of the acceleration slammed Vestera into the deck right next to Ben's unconscious form. She knew she'd have to bind him before he woke up, but Ship's mad flight was more worrying. Cold air rushed into the open portal until Ship remembered to close it. Through the translucent walls, she saw the lights of the village quickly shrink below her. "What is it?" she demanded, but Ship gave no answer. Suddenly the sky began to change colors. She looked at the night overhead and saw streaks of light overcome the stars. "Ship," she shouted. "What's happening? Is it?" Suddenly everything shook. She had the sensation of tumbling, falling helplessly out of the sky. She was surrounded by whirling light, and then her head slammed into something, and all she knew was black. Chapter 12. As her clawcraft shuddered beneath her and the inside of Celestial's hangar gave way to a starfield torn by explosions and lancing plasma, Jaina felt nothing but shame. She was leading the last flight of clawcraft left on Celestial, but even then, it felt like she was abandoning everything. Her ship, her crew, the responsibilities she fought to gain for so long. The one salve was being in a clawcraft again. She trained in the nimble fighter since she was a teenager, eager to follow the path blazed by her older pilot siblings, Davin, Cheris, most especially Jag. She'd admired them all, only to lose them one by one to flaming, heroic death, or in Jag's case, to a Jedi wife. Then she was tumbling through space, lost in the moment, jerking her fighter's control stick this way and that, dodging green laser blasts as she tried to protect the evacuation shuttles punching their way through the fighter screen toward the distant gray wedge of Vindicator. The second renegade destroyer, Resolve, had already broken away from Celestial's drifting corpse to re-engage Captain Vernadette's ship. Combined with the attacks from the 3 nimble Marauder-class corvettes, they would deliver a major pounding, and she didn't know how much Vernadette was willing to take just to rescue scraps of Celestial's crew. Vernadette's own TIE interceptors had pulled back just as 3 squadrons from Starless had arrived. The melange of clawcraft, U-wings, and X-wings were still outnumbered by the swarming TIEs from Chimera and Resolve, but at least now Jaina could tell who was friend and who was foe. She dropped in behind a TIE interceptor that was lining up for a run on one of the shuttles and pumped blue laser blasts into its central cockpit, creating an exploding that sent both dagger-shaped solar panels spinning in different directions. "Commodore," one of her pilot's voices crackled in her ear. "Time is almost up. Self-destruct imminent." "Copy," Jaina said, and turned her comlink onto the broadest just frequency. "All ships, self-destruct imminent. Clear Celestial. Repeat, clear Celestial." She kicked her engines hard, outpacing the shuttles. She rolled her clawcraft into a tight arc that pulled her back around to face Celestial, this time from a safe distance. Despite herself, she felt despair claw at her chest. Celestial had been her command, her responsibility, but in the end it had been helpless against the combined onslaught of 2 Imperial Star Destroyers. Now its systems were dead, and its graceful dark body slowly drifted away from the ugly wedge of Chimera. She saw that doll-ass destroyer was breaking away, her boarding shuttles returning to Earth. They must have discovered the self-destruct countdown. A shame, Jaina thought. She so wanted to take Dala with her. There was a brilliant flash of light. Jaina jerked her craft away lest she be blinded, even through the shaded lenses of her helmet. When the light dimmed, Celestial's charred, blackened, twisted hull remained. She looked eagerly for damage to Chimera and saw some black scoring on the destroyer's underside, but nothing critical. "Alch's craft," she told the general frequency. "Punch for Vindicator. Go now." She hoped to take advantage of the confusion left by Celestial self-destruct. Unfortunately, it seemed the Imperial pilots had been told in advance. Most of them had escaped the blast and were now making runs on the fleeing shuttles. One right in front of Weinsa burst into flames, and she had to roll hard to port to keep from running through the blossoming debris field. Just as she pulled out of her roll, a chain of TIE fighters swooped down from the port side. Their laser fire splattered over Weinsa's shields, jerking her in her cockpit. Two dropped behind her and began lancing green plasma at her clawcraft. As she moved to evade, something black flashed against the starfield ahead of her. She glanced at her tactical screen and saw both TIEs suddenly wink out. "Chiss ships, this is Wraith Squadron," a harsh mechanical voice grated on her headset. "The Gamorrean, Sabinering. Is Commodore Fell with you? Repeat, did Commodore Fell evacuate?" Weinsa switched to a matching frequency. "Commodore Fell reporting, Wraith 1. One of your birds just blew ties off me." "Thank the Force," a woman's voice said with relief. "My sister said she'll bust my butt if I don't get yours home safe." Weinsa was about to ask just what she was talking about when light flared in the corner of her vision. She tilted her clawcraft to allow her a better view of the planet. Her jaw dropped in shock as a great banner of rainbow light, like a glimmering aurora, seemed to stretch out of Zanamasek's atmosphere and reach into lower orbit. Suddenly, the rainbow light swept through space like a downward arm. It cut through a cluster of ships: a True Victory destroyer, 2 gunships, a carrier, and the Mon Cal interdictor, and all of them disappeared in a giant fiery blossom. Then another banner of light appeared, this one stabbing through space and punching through both of the Bothan cruisers moving into attack Starless. It was second, Weinsa thought in awe. She'd heard this living planet could take extraordinary means to defend itself, but she'd never been one to believe in fantastic stories. She never even believed there was some governing consciousness. She thought it all fairy tales made up by the Jedi, but now the raw evidence of Seket's power left her breathless. Then there was another flash of light, and the planet was gone. What happened? One of the wraiths was squawking. "Where'd it go?" "It's gone," Sabinering pronounced. His mechanical voice managed a tone of gravity. "Zanamasekhet left." Jagged struggled to stand upright. Every single crewman on Starless had suddenly been thrown to the deck by the unexpected turbulence, and Jag himself had hit his head on the tactical console before going down. As he clutched his bleeding forehead, a hysterical corner of his mind thought, "At least I didn't lose the other eye." He grabbed the console with both hands and pulled himself to his feet. Before he could bark orders, Syal and Tilly shouted, "All hands, at your stations. Tactical team, report." Someone said, "The planet, Captain. It's gone." Gone. The word seemed to reverberate forever in Jag's head. Ben, Tahiri, Jaina. Gone. Maybe the U.S. Hinvong infiltrators had done something. Maybe the planet had somehow chosen to flee on its own. Maybe the engines had misfired somehow. He might never know. He might never see his wife again. Jagged tried to calm himself. The entire battle had left him in a state of constant near panic, but now he shoved it all down and found the orderly, disciplined officer he'd been bred to be, the kind they all needed right now. "Give me a status on the fleet," he said. The tactical holo was down, so he turned his attention to the front viewport and tried to make sense of the broad swath of warships and debris. "Zanamasekhet did something, sir," a dumbfounded lieutenant said. "Both Bothan cruisers are gone," another reported. "Phoenix seems to be adrift in space. Engines down." "What about ours?" Vindicator and Swift were far enough away. "What about Mondromeda?" Creffy asked. He pulled himself to his feet, claw scraping across the console metal. A streak of red blood gleamed against the white fur of his snout. After a long, grim pause, the lieutenant said, "She's gone, sir. All the ships there, the gunships, the Vic, they're all gone. No, wait, the cruiser, Sunbeam, she's drifting in space, but she's intact, I think." "What about the starfighters?" Jag wiped a trickle of blood off his eyebrow. "It's hard to tell. There's so much debris." "Sirs," the comm lieutenant said, "we're getting a transmission from Vernadette." "Put him on," Jag said. "Commander, we're having problems with the holo emitter." "Audio, then," Creffy snapped. "Do it now." A second later, the old Imperial's voice reverberated on the bridge. "Starless, this Vindicator. We're bringing the last Chiss ships in now. What in space just happened?" Jagged's relief to have recovered wind was a mild bomb on the latest catastrophe. He said, "The planet just jumped to hyperspace. Before that it defended itself against true victory." "I can't see that," Bernadette grunted. "Commander, I wait. It looks like Dala is on the move." Jagged cursed inwardly. Dala still had 2 Star Destroyers, an Interdictor, and 3 Marauder corvettes that had been out of range of Seket's attack. Out the viewport, he could see the 2 Mon Cal cruisers loyal to Erefta firing their sublight engines. Seket may have taken out half the true victory fleet, but including Dala's forces, what was left was enough to tackle the broken ships Jagged had. "Commander," the tactical lieutenant said, "Dala just jumped to hyperspace." Bernadette said, "Starless, she just jumped." "Repeat." "We saw, Captain, thank you." Jagged breathed. He could see the 2 Mon Cal ships, apparently unharmed by Zanima Seket's attack, hovering in the middle of space like they were uncertain what to do. "Well," he thought, "that makes 3 of us." "Come on," he said, "hail those Mon Cal ships, the Lysentra and Niathal," Creffy supplied. "Right," Jagged nodded, suddenly very tired. "Hail Sunbeam and Phoenix too. Tell them we will accept their surrender should they choose to offer it." Half the crew stared at him, uncertain what to say. These ships, their crews and officers, had been Alliance, yes, but they'd also just fought a pitched battle that had claimed thousands of crew and officers from Trinity Fleet. "Now, come," Sayal said firmly. "Yes, ma'am." The lieutenant began to adjust the frequency. Sayal walked over to the tactical console against which Jagged and Creffy both leaned, weak and bleeding. Jagged's cousin looked disheveled, yes, but unharmed physically. "Do you think they'll do it?" she asked. "We have to give them the option," Jagged said. "And if they don't take it?" "Sirs," the communication officer called. "Lysentra says she will surrender." Jagged felt breath go out of him. "What about the others?" "Niathal is considering the offer. Nothing from Phoenix or Sunbeam. Those ships are damaged. They might not be receiving our transmissions," Creffy said. "They're also in no shape to fight," said Jagged. "With Lysentra down, Niathal should follow." "What about Phoenix?" Sayal asked. Her eyes held on Creffy. The Bothan licked specks of blood from his canines. He pushed himself away from the console and started toward the communication station. "Lieutenant," he said, "hail Phoenix again. Tell them I want to speak with Brennan Refcha, personally." When the light had lashed out of Zanima Seket like a brilliant deadly rainbow, Miranda Fardreamer had expected to die. A part of her had been filled with dread, but another felt a surge of surprise and joy unlike anything she could remember. But then the light receded and she was alive, again, and things were worse than ever. Zanima Seket's shocking attack, and equally shocking disappearance, had left Phoenix's normally orderly bridge in a state of total chaos. The force of the attack had collapsed Phoenix's shields and tore open the decks hastily repaired since the fight in the nebula. The command tower had taken a massive concussive impact that wrenched its support structure, burst the aft bulkhead, and sent shrapnel cutting through the air like hundreds of flying knives. Miranda and most of the crew in the pit had escaped unscathed, but many on the upper level had been instantly and messily killed. Miranda had seen Erefta fall, and was sure he was dead. Captain Welby was bleeding from the head and right leg but was trying to hold things together, even though she could barely stand. When she called Miranda out of the pit to replace the crew at the comp station, the Bothan had shocked them both by rising to his feet. As he staggered toward Welby, Miranda saw that he was clutching his left arm with his right. Everything below the elbow, uniform and silver fur alike, were dyed red with blood that dripped slowly and steadily onto the shrapnel-laden deck. She wondered how much time he had in him. She wondered how many any of them had. Miranda's technical knowledge of communication systems was minimal, and she spent several minutes handing tools to a lanky, brown-furred Frost lieutenant who was the only one of the communications crew not cut down by shrapnel and lying dead at their feet. The frost did something to bring the console back online, and a bright red beacon winked on and off. "What does that mean?" Miranda asked. "Incoming call," the Frost rasped. He punched a button, bent close to the speaker grill on the console, and said, "This is Phoenix. Please repeat your message." "This is Traz Creffy on Starless. I wish to speak with Admiral Arefja. Is he alive?" Creffy, dazed by the shock of the attack, by the gore and burnt debris strewn around her, it took her a second to place the name. The biggest hero of the U.S. and Vong War, Arefja's mentor, was on the line right now. "Admiral," she called, spinning around to look for Arefja. She was shocked to find him right in front of her. His silver fur was matted with sweat, dirt, and other people's blood. His own dripped steadily from the red, mangled mess of his left arm while his right paw pinched the blood vessels above his elbow to slow the bleeding. His gold eyes were half-focused and his mouth panted open. "Admiral," Miranda stuttered. "It's Creffy." Arefja blinked once, twice. A little focus came into his eyes. He rasped, "Step aside, Ensign." Miranda scooted back, nearly tripping over the maimed corpse of a Rodian. Still clutched his left arm, Arefja leaned in close to the speaker grill and said, "This is Arefja." "You're alive." Relief was palpable in that voice. "Bren, listen to me. You have to surrender." Arefja's body rested in a soundless, humorless laugh. "Bren," Creffy pressed, "half your fleet is destroyed. Admiral Dalla has taken her destroyers and fled. Captain Jennings has surrendered La Centra. Trev Varen just did the same. All your other ships are destroyed or dead in space." Arefja picked his head up with effort and looked out the viewport. Miranda followed his gaze and saw the dark gray wedge of Starless gliding closer. In front of it was the black, twisted remains of a Bothan assault cruiser's aft engine section, Felia or Darylin, she couldn't tell, and it didn't matter now. Arefja swallowed and said to his crew, "Engines, report." No one said anything at first. Then someone called, "Sublight down. Hyperdrive down." "Bren," Creffy shouted over the comm. "There's no point in fighting. You have lost. Don't throw away your life. Don't throw away the lives of your crew." Arefja leaned in close to the speaker and hissed, "I have a mission." "Your mission is over," Creffy insisted. Arefja insisted, "I'm not your man anymore." Arefja turned back to the crew. "I need weapons report." "Enough good people have already died, Bren." "Port turbolaser bank online," Welby said. "Forward bank, online. Starboard, offline." A chill shot down Miranda's spine. He was going to do it. He was going to order those turbolaser banks to fire on Starless. They had no chance of winning, no chance of escape. They couldn't even move, but Arefja was broken enough, desperate enough, mad enough at the carnage around him to order one last suicidal attack. And standing right next to him, staring at the face of certain, absolute death, Miranda Fardreamer realized she didn't want to die after all. Not here. Not like this. Not for nothing. Her mother had died for nothing. Her father had died for nothing. She wanted to live for something, anything. "Bren, please," Creffy was pleading, half forgotten over the comlink. "Do you think Evan would want this?" That name, whatever it meant, snapped Arefja out of his battle-dazed stupor. He leaned over the console and said, "Don't you dare, Trast. Don't you dare bring her into this." "You already have," Creffy accused. "There's no point in calling down more death. Surrender, surrender now, and I promise no harm will come to you." "We're renegades," Arefja snarled. "Criminals. Each and every one of us. We betrayed the Alliance. We just murdered thousands of our fellow officers. What do you think you're going to do with us?" "I can't decide that myself," Creffy said. "But if you help us, join our fleet, you'll probably get a general amnesty for most of your people." Arefja's head wagged from side to side. No. We went out here to kill the U.S. and Vong, to annihilate them. We came here to finish the job you couldn't, Trast. We're not going to help you save the enemy. Then save your friends. We've lost half our fleet and Dalla is still out there. The renegade U.S. and Vong fleet, True honor, they're still out there too. If you don't help us, all of us will die out here. Arefja blinked, swayed on his feet. True honor. They broke off from Zanima II to wage war against their old enemy. Sound familiar? No, Arefja said. They're the enemy. They don't, they're not like. The Bolton's strength gave out. His knees buckled and he pitched forward. Miranda grabbed him by one shoulder, the Froze by the other, and they helped him upright. His left paw still clutched his right elbow, curtailing the blood loss. It was the only thing keeping him conscious right now. His head rolled weakly to the right, and for a moment his gold eye settled on Miranda's. The war is over, Bren, Creffy said. The war ended a long time ago. Arefja swayed, but Miranda held him upright. His jaw worked up and down wordlessly before he finally found the strength to say, all right. We surrender, we surrender.